Good morning, everyone. If I could ask that you take your seats and we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I want to welcome all of you who are here with us and to our audience watching online via live webcast. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to be opening today's conference where we'll officially launch the Global Business and Economic Program's timely report on the future of the European economy and its importance to the United States. I want to encourage all of you in the room and all of you watching to join the conversation using the hashtag EUGrowth. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to the many ambassadors who have joined us, who are with us today. Thank you for being part of this discussion, and to thank many of our guests who have traveled across the Atlantic to be with us. And a special welcome and thank you to Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat and to Prime Minister Jose Barroso, who have so ably led the Council's EuroGrowth Task Force. Thank you for your leadership. Before I hand over the mic to Ambassador Eizenstat to officially kick off the conference, I want to make just a quick announcement, but an important one. The Atlantic Council has a global business and economics program essentially for two fundamental reasons. First, we simply couldn't pursue our mission effectively at the Atlantic Council if we didn't factor in geoeconomics. Indeed, the premise of today's report and much of our work is that the failure to accelerate growth in and of itself is a challenge, a threat to our community and its values. But the second reason we have this programming is because of the strong support from our board. And in this context, no one more than Ambassador Borden-Gray has helped us to ensure that we have the resources to be an effective voice on issues of finance and growth. So today we're pleased to announce that Andrea Montanino, who many of you know is the director of our Global Business and Economics program, will also become the C. Boyden-Gray Fellow on Global Finance and Growth. Thank you, Boyden, and thank you, Andrea. Congratulations. Andrea joined the Council in early 2015 after a long career at the Italian Finance Ministry and the International Monetary Fund with some time at the European Commission, and he's provided the intellectual leadership for the Council's economic work, as well as served as the rapporteur of this report, where he did a terrific job of pulling together the various pieces into a comprehensive, cutting-edge analysis of the European economy and its importance to American prosperity. Ambassador Gray, who's well known in these circles at the Council, has been a long-standing leader at the Atlantic Council. He worked in the White House for 12 years, first as counsel to the Vice President during the Reagan administration, and then as White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush. And he left his imprint, a very strong imprint, on the issues of regulatory relief during his service. Under President George W. Bush, Ambassador Gray served as ambassador to the European Union and as U.S. Special Envoy to Europe for Eurasian Energy. He continues to serve as the vice chair of the Atlantic Council and on our board of directors, on the executive committee of the board, has made important contributions to today's report as a member of the task force. Thank you very much, Boyden. It's without supporters like Ambassador Gray, the Council simply couldn't do its work and fulfill our mission to promote constructive leadership and offer a forum for navigating the economic and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic. So thank you very much. Now I want to be able to get the program started by turning over the floor to Ambassador Stu Eizenstat, another long-standing supporter and leader on the executive committee of the Council's board of directors. Ambassador Eizenstat not only co-chaired the EuroGrowth Task Force that produced today's report, but he also heads the Council's work on Iran and contributes to all of our work related to Europe here. Ambassador Eizenstat has one of the sharpest minds in Washington, and so many successful public servants have been mentored by him during his service over 3 administrations. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, as Deputy Secretary of Treasury in the Clinton administration, as Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Carter, as Undersecretary of Commerce, of Undersecretary of State. In these roles, he was an architect of the transatlantic agenda with the EU and helped develop the transatlantic business dialogue antecedents that really underpin much of the work you see today. So with that, Ambassador Eizenstat, let me turn over the floor to you. Thank you very much for your leadership on this effort.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, especially to my co-chair, Jose Manuel Barroso, the former President of the European Commission and former Prime Minister of Portugal, who will speak in the second panel of today's conference. And I want to thank all the members of the task force. This really is a joint effort, and the report shows the impact of all the members of our task force. Today we're launching the Euro Growth Task Force inaugural report, and it is the result of the Euro Growth Initiative that we started literally a year ago. We brought this initiative to life in March of 2016 with the goal of providing a blueprint of how to restore sustainable and inclusive economic growth across Europe. In our view, and I want to state this very clearly, the greatest threat to the European Union comes from the absence of sustained economic and job growth. And the best way to revive confidence in the European Union and in the whole European integration project is to stimulate greater economic and job growth and more innovation. This report underscores also why a strong Europe is absolutely vital to the United States. The EU is the largest recipient of U.S. goods and services, and the European countries are by far the largest foreign investors in the United States, sustaining over 7 million jobs in our country. Calling this report timely would be an understatement. The European Union is facing great uncertainty. Its stagnant economy is subject to significant economic and political headwinds. Populism and nationalism are on the rise. Brexit looms large, and 3 of the 6 EU founding states, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and perhaps Italy as well, will hold elections this year. An EU-wide solution to the ongoing wave of migration is nowhere in sight, and Greece continues to suffer from an unsustainable debt burden. The report that we released today addresses the challenges facing Europe with a focus on short-term responses, medium-term deliverables, and long-term plans for better integration of economic policy making. Let me say at the outset that several EU member states have taken very positive steps in areas like labor market reform, apprenticeship training, sound fiscal policies, which can be usefully replicated by other states. Also, we in the United States have much to learn from Europe. This report aims to recommend 5 main messages. First, after a mutually agreeable Brexit, the EU needs to make a palpable, positive difference in the lives of its citizens. And I want to say very clearly also, and I think President Barroso, you would agree, that one of the problems fundamentally is that European politicians blame their own problems on Brussels, and the positive aspects they take for themselves. Second, a strong EU makes the U.S. stronger. Higher rates of growth in Europe will directly translate into higher rates of growth in our country. Third, to foster growth and restore confidence in the EU, there must be higher levels of investment and innovation. One key finding in the report is that these are impeded by inadequate capital markets, with 80% of private capital provided to business coming from traditional commercial bank loans, and too little available for startups and medium-sized and small enterprises from venture capital, private equity, IPOs, and other non-bank equity financing, which are critical in the United States, where only 20% of private capital comes from bank loans. This is a substantial deterrent to innovation in Europe and job growth. It also must be said that EU member states, like Germany, which run persistent large current account surpluses, should adopt more demand-driven growth to help other member states grow and avoid the imbalances which feed resentment. Fourth, in addition to more investment, the EU must push projects that are key to growth at a time of historic low borrowing rates, and they can be implemented in the next 24 months. And finally, we advocate in the longer run that the founding EU member states and those states with strong economies move toward greater fiscal cooperation and integration through measures like Eurobonds to build a Europe of concentric circles. The main author of the report and the director of the Atlantic Council's Global Business and Economic Program, Andrea Montanino, will present the report's main findings and recommendations in more detail. But I want to say personally that Andrea's leadership has been absolutely stellar and indispensable, and he has been an inspiration to those of us on the task force. His clear vision over the course of a year has provided the driving force to make this report a reality. After Andrea's presentation, we will have a stellar panel to discuss what directions Europe should take to foster growth. Is there a need for more or less Europe? This panel will feature Olivier Blanchard, the Fred Bergston Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, Xavier Rollet, CEO of the London Stock Exchange, Paul Thompson, the Director of the IMF's European Department, and then after a short coffee break, a second and critically important panel will feature Gordon Bajnai, former Prime Minister of Hungary, my co-chair, Jose Manuel Barroso, Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State, and Raymond McDonald Jr., CEO of Moody's. They will discuss how U.S. economic policies can affect EU growth and vice versa. To conclude our conference, European Commission Vice President and Commissioner for Digital Single Markets, Andrus Ansip, will deliver keynote remarks, and you'll see in our report a call for a clearly needed completion of the digital single market. We're honored to have Vice President Ansip join us today to hear the position of the European Commission on how to stimulate Europe's growth and why it's important to the U.S. So finally, this report, which we're releasing this morning, does by no means conclude the work of the Euro Growth Initiative. There is much more to be done. And I hope this report will increase the reach and impact of our initiative and provide momentum to build upon the excellent body of work that this report embodies into the balance of this year and beyond. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Andrea Montanino to the stage. Thank you again, Andrea, for your great help.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Stu, for your kind words, and also thank you, Boyden, for the fellowship. I'm really honored. So this report is really about a possible path for Europe. There is a road. The road, as you see in the presentation, has bumps, has clouds, has curves, but it's doable. We think it needs a vision and a strong leadership, and also that actions are needed now. We try to make a case on why European economy growth is important. It's important for the EU, of course, but it's important also for the United States. And we try to look at how to achieve better results. So let's start on why European growth is important for the EU. I mean, this is obvious. But why is it particularly important now? We see at least three reasons. The first is that since the start of the convergence process in 1992, European economy has grown approximately by 1 percentage point less than United States each year. So it means that when Europe grew, when the US grew at 4%, Europe grew at 3. When it was 2, it was 1. Of course, there are differences across years. There are years, of course, when Europe grew more than the United States. But over the 25-year time span since the start of the convergence toward the euro, more or less the difference has been 1 percentage point. And this is an unfortunate coincidence because people now associate, European citizens associate economic integration and common currency with comparatively slow and worse economic outcomes. We all know that the reasons behind European growth are many. It's not the currency, it's not the European Union, but this is what people see. And therefore, Eurosceptic parties are gaining strength in many member states, and local population, local leaders in several countries in Europe now favor national, non-EU wide solutions. So we think that more growth is necessary to change the narrative about European integration. A second reason is youth unemployment. Youth unemployment sits above 20% in Europe now, which may consign over 4 million youth unemployment people to unemployment over the next decade, if this is not reversed, and create a generation defined by political extremism and on both the left and the right. At the same time, European population, as you know, is aging. The current demographic trends show that in the next decade, the European Union will move from 4 to 2 working age person per retiree, putting significant pressure on healthcare and pension system. So more growth is to avoid a lost generation and to prepare the future. And the third reason is that Europe is also in the middle of a tempest of geopolitical tensions. All the major conflicts are around Europe. The Ukraine-Russian conflict, the turmoil in the Middle East that has resulted in migrant crisis and terror attacks. All these underscore the fragility of Europe's economy and will continue to do in the foreseeable future. So more growth is needed for Europeans to provide leaders in Europe with enough political capital, and I would say also financial resources, to handle these external threats. European growth is important for the United States. I think we have to say this very clear and very strong. There are a number of reasons. The first reason to me is money. In the graph on the right, you see the export of goods and services from the United States to its largest trading partners. And the blue line, the line on the top, is the EU 27 countries, so excluding the UK. So even in the future possible setting of the European Union, 27 countries, these 27 countries are the largest recipient of American goods and services. So, of course, more growth in Europe means more demand, more import, and therefore more export for American companies. China is far behind. UK is around 1/3 of what is EU 27. It's not only trade, it's also investment. In the 2 pie charts that are in these slides, you see the US foreign direct investment abroad on the left and the FDI in the United States. This is the stock. It's calculated at a historical basis. The largest part of the pie is, again, European Union 27. More than 40% of American investment abroad are in EU 27 countries, which means that an increase in economic growth in Europe makes a difference in terms of profits of American companies and therefore jobs growth and so on. European companies invested massively in the United States. This is the pie chart on the right. You see the section that relate to EU 27 is almost 50%. There are a lot of European companies that came in the United States to invest in this country, to bring jobs, to bring skills, especially manufacturing, to bring technology. So it's an important part of the European economy. And in order for European companies to continue to do so, of course, we need growth in Europe. It's not only money. European growth is important for geopolitical and geo-economic reasons. First of all, the EU is a major player in development aid, which is a component of the geopolitical strategy. Is the pie chart on the left. EU 27 again, with the UK outside, represent almost 42% of the development aid around the world, and together with the US, they play by far the largest role. Europe is important for crisis management. As I said before, all the crises are around Europe, and if Europe is not strong enough to handle this crisis, to be the front line, the US has sooner or later to step in. So geopolitical reasons behind European growth are important. There is also a relevant aspect for me, which is global economic governance. I mean, the world is complex. Globalization showed that a financial crisis in a tiny Mediterranean island like Cyprus can have an impact on global stability. So the world is interconnected, and we need multilateral organizations that take care about this and try to smooth these problems. The pie chart on the right shows the quota shares in the International Monetary Fund. And again, as you see there, the largest part is EU 27. They represent almost 26% of the quota share. Together with the United States, Europe managed so far to lead this organization, to provide a view, to provide a path forward, to favor financial stability. The IMF is, of course, only one example. We can have the World Bank, we can have other organizations. But these organizations are quota-based. It means that the role of each country is based on its size, its economic size. So if Europe shrinks, United States have to look forward for another partner in dealing and running this organization. And frankly speaking, we do not see a reliable partner ready to play the role that EU played so far. So this is what we think about the importance of the European economy for the United States. But we wanted to test our hypothesis, and we asked a random sample of Americans why they think Europe is important for the United States. Look at this clip. It's misspelled Europe. Sorry. So at least our sample of people think that it's important. I know it's not, I mean, probably Olivier Blanchard will disagree on my method of testing hypothesis, but that's the way I did it. So how we can get there, how we can generate more growth in Europe. As Ambassador Eisenstadt said, there is a three-pronged strategy. Short-term responses to populist concern with a deadline, say, mid-2018. to deliver concrete outcomes in the medium term with a deadline, say, by the end of the term of this European Commission. And third, to launch an ambitious long-term plan for more integration, say, with a deadline in the next 5 years. The report focuses on the EU level, doesn't look really at what single member states can do. So it's just part of the story. But we want to make a case that there is space for European institutions and for the EU as a whole to generate the conditions under which single member states then they can work for having more growth. So in the short term, there are a number of things to be, say, fixed. The first recommendation we have is to negotiate Brexit wisely, having in mind the next 20 years, not the next 2 years. The Brexit process is very complicated. I don't want to get into it. I would say it's almost impossible from an institutional point of view. But UK knows that European Union is important, and the European Union knows that UK is important. London is the European financial hub, so it provides financial resources to European companies, to the real economy, to finance economic growth. And as we all know, the UK is one of the friendliest business environment for financial services, according to the Doing Business report, for instance, of the World Bank. And it has attracted a lot of talent from both its top-ranking university and from abroad. So it will be very difficult to imagine better conditions for financial markets than those now available in London. There is an issue about the EU budget. According to the House of Commons, the UK has to contribute still 67 billion euros to the European budget until the end of the multi-annual financial framework, which is 2020. So it's after the Brexit, the supposed Brexit. So how we handle the budget is important. And then there is, of course, the relevance of the European Union in terms of trade, in terms of negotiating trade deals on behalf of the UK. So there are a lot of complexities. It's important that the negotiations starts, if they start, in the proper way with a long-term view. A second area we recommend to fix quickly is Schengen, to restore Schengen fully during this year. There is an opportunity. The number of illegal immigrants is diminishing. It's still very high. The preliminary estimates for 2016 says 400,000 people, but down from 1.8 million that arrived in 2015. And we think that the risk is that a temporary measure of limiting movement of people can become a permanent feature with cost. There are 1.7 million cross-border workers every day. There are direct costs associated with border controls, costs in terms of transportation, trade, etc. So restoring Schengen is crucial. And a third area to be fixed is TTIP. We believe that TTIP, under the current political conditions in the United States and Europe, is probably, I don't know what dead, but will be difficult to survive as it is now. But this does not mean that this is the end of a transatlantic partnership. This is not the end of a pact between Europe and United States. Rather, starting from what has been done so far in TTIP negotiation, we believe that EU and the US have to sit to the table and work on a new pact that maybe focus on areas where there is a direct, immediate benefit for both regions, but there are a lot to do. So we recommend not to kill TTIP, not to kill the idea of a pact between Europe and the United States. Another suggestion is in the report. This is maybe a little bit more controversial. And we had a lot of discussion in the task force on that. But we think that there is a window of opportunity, and the window of opportunity, as we have seen this morning, is closing. That is given by exceptionally low lending costs for the sovereign. And this window of opportunity should be used to make maybe a one-off boost of public investment. The fact is that public investment is still 40 billion euros less than its peak in the EU, and the recovery is underway, but is not strong enough to absorb unemployment. So our suggestion is one of the suggestions. I mean, as said, we recommend to explore it, is to see whether countries that have a deficit to GDP ratio below the 3% threshold can have a one-off temporary measure of 0.5% each year, this year, next year, to increase investment. As a temporary one-off measure, this can create around 80-90 billion additional euros of additional investment, with an impact, of course, on demand in the short term, but also on supply in the long term as a response to low potential growth. This is not a generalized call to additional public spending. I want to be clear on this, but it's really the idea of looking at something that is permanent and one-off. So this is the short term. In the medium term, there are a number of projects that are in the pipeline of the European Commission, and can and should be completed by the end of the term of this Commission, in order to provide the right framework. Basically, all of these projects are about deepening the internal market. In the report, we quote and we mention at least 4 areas. One is the energy union. The other is service regulation. A third is digital barrier. Maybe Vice President Ansip will talk about that later. And the fourth is the capital market union. Just let me say a word on the last one. The graph there shows the venture capital deal value in billions of dollars in the United States and in Europe. Europe is the blue bar, and it excludes UK. So you see that in terms of venture capital resources, in the European Union, there are 7 times less than what you have in the United States. But the two economies are, broadly speaking, the same size. So there is clearly a lack of alternative financial resources in Europe that is limiting, according to us, growth. So completing the capital market union, creating a larger and a broader market for alternative financial, it's vital for growth. So all these projects do not generate growth per se, but they generate the right condition for member states to take advantage and make their reforms, which are extremely important. And then the long term. Well, the long term is really what is in the news cycle in these days. The European Commission came out with a paper last week or 2 weeks ago proposing scenarios. Several European leaders met this last Monday in Paris, and there is a mounting attention on providing a new institutional architecture in Europe. Angela Merkel Monday said a Europe of different speeds is necessary, otherwise we will probably get stuck. But President Hollande already in July 2015 proposed a sort of an avant-garde of countries, of some front runners that could move for more integration. President Juncker, President of the European Commission, November 2015, said that the European Union will have to review its framework to allow some countries to do everything together and others to be less involved. So we think it's time to start with the long-term plan. The meeting of the European leaders on March 25th in Rome can be the opportunity to launch this. But what this means in practice, what is a long-term plan? Well, our suggestion is to move from what you see on the left to what we propose on the right. So from a European geometry that include different countries in different ways to something that we call a concentric circles, where you have an inner circle of countries in this graph called EFA countries. I will explain in a minute what I mean for EFA. But an inner circle of countries that move for more integration, in particular more fiscal integration. Who will be in this inner circle? Well, ideally all the Eurozone countries, but we suggest not to stop the process. And if there is an avant-garde, if there is a group of countries that want to go ahead, of course, a subset of Eurozone countries, they should be allowed to do. There are a lot of technical questions, how you do this, how you handle different level of fiscal integration with the same currency, and how you convince the benefit of that there are benefits for more integration among countries with very different budgetary position. How you put together Italy with Germany in a way. So what should countries in this inner circle do? We suggest the creation of a European fiscal authority, as said, a EFA, or at least to explore the option for a European fiscal authority that will have three main tasks. The first task is to issue common debt for growth, Eurobonds. Eurobonds not to mutualize public debt, not to finance current deficits, but really to finance infrastructure, human capital, and research and development. We think that Eurobonds will show European citizens that Europe is not only a bureaucracy that put rules, but that can do something directly and concrete. So a direct response to growth. In a way, the European Investment Bank example with the Juncker plan showed that this is possible. You can have European level doing things concrete for growth. A second task of the European Fiscal Authority might be to manage a common budget for stabilization purposes. So not just for symmetric shocks, but also asymmetric shocks. So to have an authority that really have the freedom to use some resources to stabilize the cycle. In order to avoid a sort of adverse selection, to have bad countries or poor countries going into the inner circle, you need also something else. And we think you need that the European Fiscal Authority have the right, the strength to enforce corrective measures to member countries when there is a significant deviation from fiscal target. Of course, this is a big loss of sovereignty by single member states. So it's a difficult, of course, a very difficult step. But as the graph here shows, fiscal rules as they are now not really worked over the last, say, 15 to 20 years. This graph shows the number of years that member states were above the 3% deficit to GDP ratio threshold, the Maastricht threshold. And in this table, you see that are not just the usual suspects that have a deficit to GDP about 3% for many years. So Greece, Portugal, but also France, 12 years, UK, 12 years, Spain, 9 years, Italy, of course, 8 years, but also Germany. Germany for 7 years since 2001 had a deficit to GDP ratio about 3%. This is a rough measure. We know there are, of course, cyclical reasons behind that, but an enforcement mechanism, a stronger enforcement mechanism, can maybe allow a country like Germany to join an inner circle with the countries that have high public debt. So I will conclude saying that we think European Union is a story of success, despite all the harsh headlines of recent years, the Brexit, the unemployment, low inflation. Europe has shown resilience and capacity to adapt over the years. There are short-term responses and medium-term projects that can be easily handled. Maybe not easily, but they can be handled. There is a need for a long-term plan to be started now with a vision and a strong leadership. And maybe a question is whether we have this strong leadership in Europe now. But in the meanwhile, given that this is the month of the 16th anniversary of Europe, I want to wish, and I think we have to wish happy birthday to Europe. And we have our sample of Americans doing the same, saying happy birthday to Europe. Okay. Thank you very much. I want now to kick off our first panel, dealing with the question more or less Europe options for more growth ahead of the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. And I invite our panelists to join the stage. And I want to introduce the moderator of the panel, Megan Green. Megan is the managing director and chief economist at Manulife Investment, where she is responsible for forecasting global macroeconomic and financial trends and analyzes the potential opportunities and impacts to support firms' investment teams around the world. Previously, she ran a London-based economics consultancy practice, Maverick Intelligence, and prior to Maverick, Megan was the director of European economics at Rubini Global Economics. So Megan and the panels, please join the stage. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Yeah.
Do you here?
Yeah. Hi.
How you doing? Nice to
Hi,
meet
how
you.
are you?
Hello.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Andrea. And I commend you for taking such a huge bite dealing with European growth. It's such a huge topic. We have an excellent panel here. And I can say in organizing the panel, the panelists have shown themselves to be incredibly feisty. So this should be a good one. They need no introduction, and we've had a brief one already, but we have Paul Thompson, who's the head of the Europe department at the IMF, Xavier Rollet, who's the CEO at the London Stock Exchange, and Olivier Blanchard, who was the chief economist at the IMF, but now sits at the Peterson Institute. And we've agreed to allow them each to have 5 minutes to respond to the report, and then we'll have a conversation off the back of that. So we can start with Olivier.
Okay. Good. Good morning. I think it's a very good report. We could go through each of the sections, and I'll just make a few remarks and then move on to my objections. I like the short run recommendation. I think that there's indeed room for a careful fiscal expansion. My twist would be that it might be better used to recap the banks in some countries than to do public investment, given the difficulties of doing public investment right, and the need to do recap in a number of countries soon. And I like the 4 medium-term recommendations. I thought they were well informed on energy, on banking, on services, and I think there was serious work which clearly should be explored further. Now, to the reservations in my remaining 4.5 minutes. I hesitate to say this in front of Manuel Barroso, but I thought that it was a bit politically naive as a report. I mean, one could be more polite and say too optimistic or something like this, but I think naive is. And the place where I start is I think there is, am I going to exaggerate? There is no popular support for more Europe in most of the European countries. There's support for Europe, but more Europe, I think, is really not a selling point vis-à-vis most people. And I think it's in the nature of things. In Brussels is seen as a big bureaucracy, which it is, which it has to be in a way, and is seen as an example of why Europe is not good, this additional layer. The last big project was the euro, the one which really kind of motivated people, and now it's seen as maybe not such a great thing to have had. The only exception I can think of is Erasmus, which is a program which is very, very popular with people who have used it, and maybe could be extended to more people than just college kids. But it seems to me that that has to be taken into account in what we suggest. So let me say a few things. So what if I had to write a report, I would say, well, what is it about the European construction that people object to? Are these objections warranted, and can we take care of them? And then what is it that we can add, given that there is no great enthusiasm to add anything? And I think that on the first, there's a number of features of Europe which grade people the wrong way and could be changed. So it goes, I'm going to give examples, but it goes from the symbolic to the more serious stuff. Symbolic, 2 sieges of parliament, one in Strasbourg and one in Brussels, that is seen universally as an example of waste. It would be very nice to remove it if the French government was open to it. The size of parliament, which is clearly too large and is seen widely as not working, which I think is a fair statement. Going to less symbolic but more important things, there are some mistakes. I think what's known as the directive for qualified workers, which allow workers to work in another country but paying the social contributions of the original country, creates an unfair playing field in which people in France, for example, think that they cannot compete with Polish workers in France because Polish workers have to and social contributions associated with hiring Polish workers are lower than for French workers. That is, I think it was a mistake, a very costly mistake politically. I think that should be removed. On Schengen, I'm much less eager to have it back. I mean, Schengen was designed in an environment in which that kind of flow of immigration did not exist, and it made a lot of sense, and it was a very good thing. For the moment, although the 2016 numbers are better, it is a completely different environment. We cannot protect the outside borders. We know that. It's impossible. And therefore, the notion that for some time, given that the environment has changed, we may want to suspend Schengen seems completely reasonable. It should be done, and explaining that that's not going back on Europe, the environment has changed. I fully agree that if we can go back to it quickly, it would be great, but whether it's this year or next year, I don't know. So it seems to me there's a number of things that can be done there, and the problem is that we leave these criticisms to the anti-Europeans. And I think if we accept it as the parties, as those of us who believe in Europe, as accepting that these are changes which have to be made, my list is longer, we would take away some of the arguments that the populists are using. On the second, so this was a remove or question. On the second, which is what can we add, I like very much the last slide, or next to our slides on concentric circles, although I would make them overlapping circles. It seems to me that for particular projects, some countries may want to be in, and some countries may not, and may not be concentric. It seems to me that, for example, on defense, it's clear that some countries are willing to go further than others and can create something, which actually has largely happened. Does it need to include all countries, just those who want to do it? On migration, I think it's the same thing. You can have circles of countries which basically have open borders between them and not vis-à-vis the others. On fiscal, that was discussed. It seems to me that there is a number of countries which might be willing to go further, maybe not all. It seems to me that that kind of, it's not multi-speed, it's multi-circle approach is the way to get the support that Europe needs. So these dimensions I thought were missing from the report, and I would have liked to see them there.
Okay, thank you. Xavier, let's hear your comments for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. We certainly welcome the conclusions of the report, and in particular the focus on growth. Europe was founded on the graves of 100 million people. That was the cost of World War I and World War II. And over the last 70 years, by and large, except for the Balkans, Europe has enjoyed peace. And peace initially in the 50s and the 60s meant reconstruction, meant growth. But there are 25.5 million unemployed workers in the European Union today, according to Eurostat. And although the environment has somewhat improved in the last few months, Europe still suffers from a deep deficit in terms of its economies, whether we agree that there's a single market in some areas or not, whether we agree that it's complete or not. I think most people would agree there's still a lot of work to do to truly create a single market. We, for example, do not have a single market in financial services in the European Union. And services, by and large, account for 75% of EU GDP. So it seems to us that the focus of this report is the right one, focusing on growth. Because I think few people would disagree with the political benefits of having European nations stop fighting each other. And I think we've seen and we've enjoyed those benefits, and perhaps we've forgotten the benefits of not having a European environment or European continent that is at war with each other. Perhaps not necessarily physical war, but opposition, competition, or other forms of, I would say, disagreement that prevent the focus that citizens would like to see on job creation. And so those 25 million or 25.5 million unemployed workers, how are we going to find a job for them? And we know jobs are not going to come from the government sector, which by and large in Europe is and remains very heavily indebted. Whatever the reasons were for these debts being created, infrastructure investment, the funding of a welfare system that is no longer affordable given the performance of the economy. You mentioned, sir, I think the Poles charging or being charged or paying less in terms of payroll benefits than the French. I don't think there is a nation in the world that charges less than France, actually, for payroll benefits. There is a real issue in Europe in terms of competitiveness in 3 areas. The cost of labor, not wages. Wages have been flat for 25 years in many countries, but the cost of labor is way too high. In fact, is about 1/3 above the cost of labor in the United States. The cost of energy, until the fracking revolution that has impacted the cost of energy around the world, the cost of energy was 3 times higher in the European Union than in the United States. And the cost of capital, and I'll get to that in a minute, because this, we believe, is a fundamental area that needs wholesale review and restructuring. Cost of capital remains in the region of 1/3 higher than in the United States. And why is that? Because Europe is obsessed. Policymakers are obsessed with debt. You think of funding the economy, the only word that comes is bank lending. 80% of corporate funding in the European Union continues to stem from bank lending. That only, if you look at the United States, equates to 18% over here. And that is why the Capital Markets Union, we believe, was created, a project which we strongly supported, still strongly support today. How are we going to find those 25 million jobs if they're not going to come out of the government sector, and they shouldn't? And we know that they're not going to come out of the blue chip sector either. If you look at the last period of strongly growing corporate earnings, 2005, 6, and 7, where on an average, European blue chip corporate earnings grew at 15% per annum, 3 years in a row. 15% per annum equates to doubling of corporate earnings over a 5-year period. In that period, net employment, job creation, performance by the blue chips quoted on the DAX, the MIB, the CAC, and the FTSE was negative 0.6%. And that's the most you can hope for in very good times for the blue chip sector, is to keep the stock of employment flat in the European Union, because the cost of accessing labor, of accessing energy, and accessing capital are way too high. There is a competitiveness issue that Europe is faced with. How are we going to fix this? Well, what is the last and third area that could create those 25.5 million jobs that actually is starting to receive suitable attention, I think, in Brussels, and starting to receive suitable attention by a number of European governments where ultimately real political power lay? And it is, of course, the army of 23 million small and mid-sized enterprises that populate the European Union. What do these companies tell us? Their number one problem is not access to innovation. European universities produce a lot of great science still today. It's not access to entrepreneurs. There are armies of entrepreneurs. You know, some countries have more of them. The UK has 5.4 million SMEs. France has 2.3 million. Germany, 2.6. I'll conclude briefly. I know my time is up. But what they complain about is access to capital. And why does it have to be that the only source of capital can be bank lending? What about capital markets? And now look at fragmentation, look at regulation, and look at this particular European feature that capital, if distributed through debt, is subsidized. In 2015, the treasuries of the European Union spent 570 billion euros subsidizing debt, particularly in the financial services industry, whilst long-term patient capital that underpins capital market, equities, is taxed 4 times through its life cycle for the same euro of earnings. So what we're arguing today, and what we think this report helps put in focus, is what are not only European authorities, but national authorities going to do to recalibrate the regulatory framework, the capital markets exchange framework, and more importantly, the fiscal framework to give entrepreneurs easier access to long-term patient capital equity, just like it happens here in the United States. And it is not that hard to do, but it requires one thing. It requires European government to get out of the business of deciding who, via the banking system, which is highly concentrated, who gets access to capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks. So I liked much of what I heard. I think the focus on growth is indeed very, very timely, and I agree with many of the recommendations. I agree with most of the recommendations. I do disagree with some of the short-term recommendations. I'll come to that. And like Olivier, I do think that the politics underlying it is lacking in realism, and I think that's dangerous. I think without a more realistic view on the politics, one could actually end up achieving the opposite of what you want to achieve. Let me start by reminding you that despite that Europe has been hit by adverse. There are political uncertainties all over the place, major political uncertainties, and we have Brexit. Despite of that, the recovery is actually gaining pace, and it's quite robust. And we actually are now at a stage where unemployment just fallen below 10 million, and we think in the fund that the remaining unemployment is almost entirely structural. Europe's problem, if you want, is not one of demand, if you want to put it like that. Now, that's not to say that growth potential is not a problem. We do think over the medium term, potential growth is only around 1.5. It's the low. With these growth rate, some of the weaker economies in the south will take more than 10 years for output, 10 more years for unemployment to come below pre-crisis level. That's obviously a major problem. Some of the factors that weigh on growth are crisis legacies, like high debt, but mostly they are structural problems that to a large extent predates the crisis. I mean, let me give you an example. If you compare Italy and Germany, you will have, ever since Euro adoption in 2000, you will find that manufacturing wages in Italy and manufacturing wages in Germany more or less increased in line with each other. I mean, almost match each other in Euro terms. Whereas competitors have steadily deviated, so that steadily throughout the period. So by now, there's a gap between Italy and Germany from where they were in 2000 that has opened up of 30%. It's a deep structural problem. It's if you look at the founding members of the euro and look at them before euro adoption, you will see that there was a steady convergence between of the catch-up of countries below per capita GDP with those with higher. Since euro adoption, that convergence has mostly stopped. Actually, since euro adoption and until the crisis, it mostly stopped. Since the crisis, we have had a divergence again. So there are deep structural problems that need to be dealt with. I think the first and foremost thing I want to emphasize is that most of the challenges that rise in this regard are at the national level. It is absolutely key that it is the fundamental challenges to overcome the problems that are obstacles to the productivity growth are at the national level. And so while I welcome the proposals to build on the architecture and improve the architecture, it should not mask the problem or be an excuse for not dealing with the problem at the national level. I think that is the first thing. And this sort of leads me to the thing that where I disagree with you on the short-term challenges. We have 6 countries now where debt has increased to above, 6 countries inside the Eurozone, where debt has increased to above 100% of GDP. We have indeed, so we have a large number of countries with very limited fiscal space. Europe's fundamental challenge in the sort of short to medium term is that the output gaps and the fiscal space is totally mismatched. The countries that have fiscal space, like Germany, Netherlands, have no output gap. And the countries that do not have fiscal space, like Italy, do have output gaps. What does that mean? That means if there is a shock to the system, there is a big risk that a number of countries would be forced into major pro-cyclical tightening just when the shock hits. And one can of course hope that there will be changes to the architecture that will allow more central capacity in the meantime. That is a pipe dream. That's not going to happen the next couple of years. So I would strongly urge for not to have these proposals that just countries with high debt need at this point in the cycle, where growth is relatively strong, they need to undertake fiscal consolidation. Because otherwise, as I say, they will be forced into a major, or there's a risk that they'll be forced into a major pro-cyclical tightening in the next shock. And I think one should not recommend this general suspension of the SGP that you are recommending. This leads me to what I think is my main observation, and it's pretty much in line with what Olivier said. I do think there is insensitivity to the political realities of Europe in the report. Time and again, when I talk to audiences outside the Eurozone, there's a fundamental lack of understanding on what does it mean that we have, particularly a currency union, that is not a political union. It is sometimes policy recommendations that are obvious if you are inside a political union like the one you have here, Japan or whatever it is, are profoundly difficult to implement once you're inside a union that is not a political union. Let's be blunt. There is no support at this stage for more transfer union. There are, of course, some transfer union structural funds built in, but there is no support for more transfer union. Actually, there is a deep concern that the existing structures are already encouraging moral hazards. There's a deep concern that already what is in place is discouraging some countries from adjusting. I'll not go into whether this is right or wrong. These are complex issues, but what I think is critical for what you are proposing is, if you will want to build more Europe, and I agree we need to build Europe, it needs to start with building trust between the capitals. And if you want to build trust, you need to adhere to the rules. The SGP, as you talk about, it's a cane set of rules. It must look bizarre if you sit in Washington that you have these kind of fiscal rule. But they are critical if you're inside a union that is not a political union. And the lack of enforcement of the SGP has been a major reason for the distrust. And proposing at this point in the cycle to again suspend the SGP is just going to encourage more distrust. And to me, it is a bit of a paradox that you are saying in the report, we need more fiscal union through Eurobonds, and we promise in exchange for Eurobonds to adhere to the rule, but now let's break them. That is just, I think this needs to start with adhering to the rule. So quickly, what should be done? We think that there are a number of countries with fiscal space, like Germany. They should most certainly use it to have a more expansionary policy. There are a few others also. We fully agree with that. We think that countries that are close to full employment, have no output gap, they need to accept, since they have signed up to a common monetary policy, common inflation target, that they will have inflation above the target for a prolonged period. And some of these countries that are calling for premature normalization of monetary policy should stop that. There is a need for a continued accommodating monetary policy by the ECB at this stage, and it's far too early to talk about normalizing monetary policy. And we think that Brussels needs to enforce the SGP to build the trust. Then, at the same time, we'll need to very incrementally, build on the architecture. I agree with the banking union. Is a major thing. I do actually think that even in this environment, with a lot of skepticism of Europe, I do think that capital market union is still one of the relatively low-hanging fruits that one can pick, and that is politically not that controversial, and I think one could make a process there. We agree with the Juncker, the Juncker initiative, and I think that your report contains a lot of good proposals beyond beyond the sort of macroeconomic sphere that one could work together. So let me stop here, Megan.
Okay. Thank you. You guys have given us a lot to work with. Olivier, I wanted to start off by clarifying something that you talked about. So you highlighted that there's absolutely no popular support for more Europe. And in terms of the short-term policies, the report suggests they're partly to address populism. So if further integration isn't a way to address populism, you also mentioned that you wouldn't be so sad if Schengen didn't come back. Is limiting the movement of people a way to address the populist threat that we have now?
There was a question.
That was the question. Is limiting the movement of people a way to address the populist threat that we have?
Look, I think the populism in different countries has different sources. I think immigration was partly an issue in the UK. Partly the hate of Brussels was another one. In Germany, I think it's a big issue. In France, recent immigration is not the issue, it's the lack of integration of second or third generation immigrants. But yeah, I think we have to take this into account, and to the extent that immigration from Syria, from Iraq, from North Africa is an issue now, yes, we have to be realistic and put some limits. I mean, again, because when we say we should be generous, yeah, I want to be generous, but in practice, these people will go into particular cities, and we know that there is a level of immigration in a given city or in a given neighborhood which creates very adverse reactions. We know that, and we can understand why, and I think we have to take this into account. Mm-hmm. Now again, I think this surge of immigration from the Middle East is going to come to, not to an end, but at least is going to decrease a whole lot. So I think these are temporary measures. But yes, I have no problem with recommending it.
Yeah. Okay. And another short-term measure you mentioned was recapping banks. I'm just curious where you think banks need to be recapitalized in Europe.
Well, I can think, we can name names, and then this will lead to tweets. But I mean, Italy,
yes.
Italy is surely one, and Portugal is surely another one, if I may. And here I want to actually strongly disagree with my former colleague, Poole, which is that if you actually look at the effects of issuing debt in order to recap banks so that they can actually lend more, you actually decrease the debt to GDP ratio. Mm-hmm. This is one of these things in which it's very efficient. That's money which is used very efficiently to create growth. So it has to be done well. It has to be done with taking into account governance issues and all things like this. But I think even countries like Portugal or Italy actually should be allowed to use fiscal deficits, or larger ones, in order to recap the banks. And some of the constraints there are counterproductive. The other place where I disagree with Poole is on the SGP. I don't think we should have the approach of the Trump approach to Obamacare, which is repeal and then repair. I mean, it has to be done at once, but it can be improved, and I think that it has been so badly designed that it has been counterproductive.
Okay, interesting. Xavier, you highlighted how much lending is reliant on banks in Europe.
Funding, yeah.
Funding
is
reliant.
to the tune of 80% exclusively provided by bank lending, which is a European peculiarity.
Yep, and very different from what we have here in the U.S.
Very much so.
And presumably part of that is because you've got balkanized markets. So what do you think the prospects are for Capital Markets Union? Paul mentioned that it was low-hanging fruit. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. We were a very big supporter of the Capital Markets Union. In fact, as an exchange, as an infrastructure company, we created platforms like Elite, which operates now in 27 countries in the EU, is unique. In fact, it's just signed up Israel, Morocco, Russia, and the Ukraine, which are interesting bedfellows. But where I would say is the mechanism to help fund small and mid-sized enterprise, the real economy, the guys who are actually going to create the jobs, simply except for initiatives of that sort. And Elite has now grown in 2 years from 0 to 700 companies, starting to raise billions of euros of long-term patient capital. What's the antidote to debt? It's not more debt. It's definitely not negative rates. What do you do with negative rates? You kill savers, you kill the banks, you completely throw the entire financial economy upside down. The antidote to debt, of course, is that one word that people hate me even mentioning in Europe, and it's equity. When are we going to develop an innovative European economy that can create hundreds of billions of wealth based on long-term patient capital that does not require servicing of debt, that does not require liens or mortgages or second mortgages, where the investor takes the risk with the corporate insurers? And it is that fundamental recalibration of the minds of decision makers that we think is required in Europe if we're going to have an innovative wealth-creating economy. There isn't a single market in financial services in Europe. It's a highly fragmented market. Do you know how much equities trade every day in the US? $200-300 billion. China, $600-700 billion. We've had $1 trillion days. Do you know how much equities trade in the entire European Union? And I'll get to the CMU in a second. In a good day, 40 billion. It is a deeply under-equitized environment. And now we want to do the Capital Markets Union. 70% of all financial services in the European Union are in the UK. How's that going to happen? And yet it feels today that the preoccupation of European authorities, at least some of them, rather than implementing new integrative legislation, pushing through things like MiFID II, for example, which is very late. We're in March and we still don't have the guidance on a third of the legislation that is going to take effect in January of next year. The priority seems to be to try to get back as much as possible out of the UK through the imposition of what will be effectively currency controls, restricting the ability of non-Eurozone-based infrastructure companies to clear euros in violation of equivalency agreements signed with Japan, signed with the United States. And so it seems to us, certainly in the infrastructure area, you want to create 25 million jobs, you need a capital markets union that actually helps create the structures that makes it available to these small companies that are growing very fast to access whatever type of capital they need in a fashion that is widely distributed throughout the European Union, that isn't penalized by regulation, but also isn't penalized by a deeply adverse fiscal environment. And when that recalibration happens, when governments, and I very much agree with the point you made, sir, that a lot of that responsibility lies with the national governments who have a structure for the distribution of capital which is highly concentrated in the hands of a very small number of players. When we understand that wealth creation linked to capital markets, you can call it capital markets union, is dependent on making access to patient capital easier at a lower cost for the real providers and creators of wealth, the entrepreneurs. Once we spread that out throughout the European Union, it could be an initiative like ELITE, it can be many others. In fact, there should be many others. We'll have the job creation that we believe then helps address the issues about immigration, about sharing the wealth. You've got to create it first. And so that recalibration of the mind of decision makers away from the planning of yet more debt to fund the debt that has been incurred, to fund a welfare system that many European nations can no longer afford. I wish that the indebtedness statistics of some of the southern European nations were correct. When I hear from you, sir, and I concur, that many of nations now have exceeded 100% debt to GDP, I wish these statistics were correct. But in many cases, if you look at contingent liabilities, pension fund liabilities, infrastructure debt that's been kept off balance sheet, if you look at off balance sheet items, 100% debt to GDP, to me, in many of these instances, is just an aspiration. In fact, the debt of these nations far exceeds, sovereign debt, far exceed these official statistics. And that's the issue today. The enormous amount of public debt is crowding out the private sector. And this needs to be addressed. Re-equitization of the corporate sector, making capital markets, making energy markets, making labor markets more flexible, more fungible, more attractive, more competitive. That's how we're going to create jobs. But also for the government to get out of the business of deciding who gets access to capital. And that's what you have today in the highly concentrated distribution model we have in Europe.
Can I ask really quickly, because you're focusing on equity, but when people talk about capital markets union, they're often focused on debt, which you're suggesting we need to move away from. But the conventional wisdom is you create this gargantuan capital markets union, and you need an asset class that's deep and liquid enough to be able to resist sudden stops. So do you think we can have a capital markets union focused on equity without creating such a deep and liquid asset class like Eurobonds really quickly?
We're not saying debt is bad in all shapes. There should only be equity. We are arguing for a recalibration, less dependency on debt, and bigger room made through addressing the regulatory and fiscal, the punitive regulatory and fiscal charges put on equities. When markets seized up, in 2008, 2009, 2010, which markets seized up? Debt markets, intrabank lending, securitized markets. Equity markets, they didn't seize up. Now, you might have liked the valuations.
They just tanked, yeah.
They tanked, yes, but you could still raise. In 2009, 100 billion pounds was raised in equity markets in the UK. You might not like the price, but you can still trade.
Okay.
That's not the case with debt market. When they seize up, nothing happens. So what we're arguing for is something more akin to what is here in the United States, a recalibration to make long-term patient capital available to entrepreneurs more easily accessible.
Okay, thanks. Paul, it's no wonder that someone from the IMF is highlighting structural reforms. And I'm wondering, we've obviously seen structural reforms in some of the weaker states. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what structural reforms are needed in some of the stronger states, like Germany, but also what about the new member states, because we haven't addressed those at all.
Yeah, so I think I like your emphasis on the new member states. We seem totally to forget that, and we talk about stagnation, risk of stagnation. No, thank you very much. The new member states would say we are actually growing pretty robustly, and convergence have resumed, and unemployment is again well below crisis level, and the new member states are performing very well compared to the universe of emerging markets. So there is a piece of Europe that's working very well that we should remember. Now, on the structural reforms, clearly countries like Germany have a long menu of structural reforms that they need to do, and many of them could be helpful in unlocking stronger demand. And so I sort of certainly would welcome that. Now, let me just one reply to Olivier's point. I was obviously not saying that that recapitalization of the banking system is not as essential, as critical. It needs to happen for anything to be credible. Of course, I was reacting to the proposal on infrastructure spending and suspend the SGP on infrastructure spending. I agree the SGP is in dire need of being. No, it's a mess. It's far too complicated. It needs to be simplified. It needs to be reformed. No doubt about that. My only point is that if you want to build the mutual trust that allows us to make an incremental progress on the architecture, you need to adhere to the rules. And sort of changing the rules, saying they don't make any sense. If that's being seen as a sort of backdoor way of even at this strong point in the cycle of having a fiscal expansion, you're going to have problems. You're going to have political problems. So that was my only point. Let me just say on the link to this, there's this call for more fiscal union, and I think the word was true Eurobonds. And let's get to the heart of my point. If you are in the highly indebted countries and you talk about fiscal union, what do you hear? It's proposed about Eurobond mutualization. If you are up north and you talk about fiscal union, what do you hear? Well, it's about political union. It's about, if you want to have the benefit of our mutualization, we also want to have a view on when you should retire, and et cetera, et cetera. So these are, of course, the complexities of it, and it has to go hand in hand.
Yeah. And do you think we need, let's say we had Eurobonds magically, do you think we would need a fiscal authority to manage them? Because credit card companies, for example, have mutualized debt. There's no central authority. So is a fiscal authority absolutely essential for fiscal union, do you think?
I think it depends on what Eurobonds you have in mind. I think there are possibilities which do not require more fiscal structure than now. And there's a proposal which is to securitize for the private market, to securitize the existing bonds and then have 2 tranches or 3 tranches. That can be done, I think, under the existing fiscal rules without much danger. That would be progress. You can be more ambitious, but that seems feasible now.
Okay. Interesting. I'd like to open it up to the crowd, and I'd like to start off with soliciting a question from Boyden Gray, if you've got one.
Well, my question is about the key point of SME, small business, where the jobs are created and the relationship to the capital markets. My experience has been in the United States that Europe does quite well with vocational training, and we could learn a lot from you how to do that. We just don't have a very good system. I think conversely, you could learn, excuse me, a lot from us about transferring innovation from your great universities to your entrepreneurs. Capital plays a role in this, but I don't think it's the only problem. I think there is not the same. We have a legislation called Bayh-Dole, that's former Senator Bayh, which facilitates the transfer of patented or patentable material the private sector for use in profit-making enterprises, which universities can't do very well and probably for conflicts reasons shouldn't do. So that is my question. Is this something you're focusing on? Is it getting better? Is it being done? Because I think there's an enormous amount of talent in the universities in Europe that's on the table being lost.
That's a very good question, sir. In fact, I've happened to be an angel investor in one such university offshoot in biosciences. And so this was prior to my time with the stock exchange, so about 10 years ago. But I went with these scientists, I'm not a scientist myself, through the whole process of seeking to recruit capital, long-term patient capital, equity capital in Europe. At the time, this was 10 years ago, for biotech business, which have specific risk return profile and require many years. They require that patience. And in those days, it wasn't possible, the companies in the United States today. I've seen changes in the last 5 or 6 years, particularly in the United Kingdom. It's been focused initially around manufacturing, fintech, software, and there's no doubt that the fact that the UK in the last 5 years has gone from about 2.5 million to 5.4 million SMEs. UK created 655,000 new businesses, net creation last year. France did 60,000. So there's something happening, and certainly it has been in the UK, and we're starting to see in a number of cities across the continent the beginning of a tech revolution. It can be biotech, it can be energy, it can be software. So I think things are changing. They're clearly not good enough, but the UK, for example, created the patent box. So there has been changes in regulations. But the key point that these startups continue to tell us is, of course, the technology, the ideas, the staff, but universities tend to recruit from all over the world, and that continues to be their strength. And I hope that the new immigration policies aren't going to stop that, because that would definitely be the end of European universities, as it would be anywhere else. But the recruitment of capital, or patient capital, not debt, remains the biggest problem. But we are starting to see some interesting changes, and I would say particularly in the United Kingdom.
Great.
Let me just add that
Sure.
the wealth in San Francisco is extraordinary.
For sure. They've been going at it, not for 5 years. They've been going out. Basically, if you look back at the tech revolution started in the mid-'80s when Microsoft moved out of Albuquerque onto the West Coast. And it was really the mid-'80s and early '90s where the tech revolution started. And what happened there in the mid-'80s starting to happen in the UK today, obviously on a smaller scale. Some of the technology, like graphene, for example, I like to mention that example that came out of University of Manchester. That's world class. It's going all over the world. So there is a revolution going on, but it's early stages, which is why it is so important, it seems to us, that governments as well as the European Union stop focusing on an incredibly complex system that no one manages anymore. We're talking about securitization for SME funding. This will never happen. It's a contradiction in term. Let's focus on entrepreneurs. Let's focus a little less on fighting each other with all sorts of regulation as to which capital will seize which business from which other capital. And let's focus on the needs, the declared needs. When we launched Elite in Brussels, we took 60 entrepreneurs from all over Europe, from Lithuania down to Portugal and Israel all the way up to Scotland, to tell MEPs, to tell commissioners, this is what we need. That can be done. We can do that, we can save Europe. We continue to focus on academic debates about further integration or not integration, and this and that and the other structure around that. Frankly, I would not rate the survival chances of the European Union at more than 50% today if we don't change very quickly the direction of travel, in my humble opinion.
Okay, there are a lot of hands, so in the interest of getting as many questions in as possible, I'm going to take 3 at a time, but please make them, the questions and the answers, pretty short. So we'll start here.
Apologies for being
Yeah.
My name is Walter Jurasek. My simple question is, why so much is emphasis of globalization, including Brussels, instead of localization? The small businesses, they know better what to do than micromanagement from Brussels. So my question is why, with so much emphasis on globalizations?
Okay, we'll take a question from over here. As well.
Thank you. My name is Katerina Sokou with Greek Daily Kathimerini. Ambassador Eisenstadt mentioned the Greek debt as a concern not only for Greece but for Europe as well, and as a challenge. And it just came from Delphi, where it seemed like the private entrepreneurs were eager and desperate, really, to see growth returning to the Greek economy. I'm wondering, what do you think can happen on a European level within a Euro growth initiative for this Greek economy to recover, and whether you think that the 3.5% primary surplus target that seems to be the idea these days for the next 5 years can really, what the effect will be on growth of such a policy. Thank you.
Okay, and then we have one up here.
Thank you.
There's
Very
the
interested in
mic.
what you're saying. Just perhaps a more positive note in terms of the Bayh-Dole question that you mentioned. Helsinki and Stockholm, Estonia, TUM in Munich, the Catholic University of Leuven, not to mention Cambridge, are all hotbeds of very active innovation. And some, like Berlin, have emerged in the last 5 years. You mentioned a lot about the need for patient capital, and you talk about a lot of European programs. And I think it would be useful, and I'd like your view on this, to talk about the substitution effect, that when you get EU programs in place, then the nations no longer venture into that space, and I think that's disastrous. You also you've mentioned several times patient capital, but you make no mention of the SBIR program, which provides $3 billion a year, which is 3 times what the venture capital community provides for startups.
Okay, thanks. Paul, I'll start with you. We'll go in the reverse order this time around.
What do you want me to answer? Which one? Greece,
Yeah.
I assume. Okay.
That was for you.
Well, I think our view on Greece is very clear. We think on the debt, we think Greek debt is clearly unsustainable. What do we mean by that? That we mean no amount of reforms and adjustment by Greece will make debt sustainable without some relief measures from the European side. We also think that no amount of debt relief will help Greece without a much stronger structural reform in Greece. As far as the question of the 3.5% fiscal surplus, we think that it's one could target less if Greece and the Europeans agree on 3.5. That will affect growth adversely for a while, no doubt about that, compared to a lower surplus. So, I mean, our views on this, I think, are well known. So let me just stop here.
Okay, thanks. Xavier, did you have a response?
I mean, there were several questions here, and I would say, in general, the fact that the EU or a number of national governments have started programs, and it is undeniable that throughout the EU, whether it's in the Nordic countries, the southern countries, Central, Eastern Europe, there are areas where entrepreneurial spirit clusters of innovation are started. Could be fintech, could be biotech, but it's also not a coincidence that the country where they have been the most successful at converting that science into real businesses, and it's still early stage, and we're still at the early stage of that path from startup to startup, is the UK, because the UK has by far the most developed capital markets. And again, it's 70% of EU financial services. So I would say, though, that although there is state support in the EU coming out of Brussels, coming out of national government, there is also state support in the US. This will never work if state capital or state-funded capital is the main source of capital. There has to be low-cost, easy-to-access mechanism for entrepreneurs throughout the entire Union, from the east to all the way to the west, to access alternatives to bank lending. And if we do not find a way to turbocharge, make it easier, turbocharge access to that long-term patient capital, what you were talking about, sir, which is those hotbeds of innovation, 2 things will happen. They'll either sell out too quickly, because you've done the family of friends in the second round and the third round, and you're many, many years from listing in the market, And we know how ossified listed markets are in many European countries because they're way too small. They don't have the liquidity. So if you're at an early stage, at some point, what happens? You got great technology. You don't have the next sort of step in the ladder, in the capital ladder. You sell out. And you mostly sell out to perhaps Silicon Valley-based enterprise. So what we're losing is the transformation of that intellectual property investment in our universities. We're losing access to the 100, 2, 3, 400 billion dollar or euros or whatever currency you want companies because they're not in the EU. That's what's going to create the wealth to pay for all the other things we want. Good education, free transportation, healthcare, and all the welfare. That is a good thing. But that has been funded by debt for the last 20 years or so. And those bills are coming due today.
Okay, let's hear from Olivier on those various questions.
On that very question, I know much less than you do, so I'll leave it aside. I'll just say that I agree with Pour on Greece, which is, it seems to me that what the fund is pushing, which is a lower primary surplus and debt restructuring, are absolutely essential. But there are necessary conditions, they are not sufficient conditions. I mean, it is absolutely striking if you look at the decrease in the current account deficit in Greece, which is now more or less back to zero. It is entirely from import compression due to low activity. None of it is due to an improvement in export. If they can't take care of that, and that means structural reforms of some sort, then even the things that the fund is recommending would not be enough.
Yeah. Okay, great. We've got to end it here, unfortunately. Please stick around for the next panel, which will discuss how the EU and US economies impact one another. We have a coffee break now, but we're going to reconvene at 11, so in 10 minutes here.
So we are we are moving to our second panel, which will look at how U.S. economic policies can affect EU growth and vice versa. But given the fact that we have on the stage two former prime ministers of Europe, I'm sure they will want to comment about the political realism we discussed before. I just want to introduce the moderator of the panel, Susan Lund. Susan is a partner at McKinsey & Company, a leader of the McKinsey Global Institute. We all are probably familiar with their analysis. I personally like a lot. In this capacity, she conducts economic research on financial markets, labor markets, and global growth outlook, which makes her the perfect moderator for this panel. So, Susan, you can introduce your guest, and I look for tough questions to them.
Okay, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate you, Andrea, on the wonderful report. Whether or not you agree with the recommendations, it's very well written, it's very clear, and I think very cogently argued. So I am joined by a really distinguished group of panelists. To my immediate left, we have a man who probably needs very little introduction, Jose Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission and former prime minister of Portugal, currently non-executive chairman at Goldman Sachs. Next to Mr. Barroso, we have Paula Dobriansky. She is former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. She is currently a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Then we have Gordon Bajnai, who is the former Prime Minister of Hungary, until very recently was the Group COO of Meridiam and is now the chairman. And then last on the panel, but certainly not last, we have Raymond McDaniel, Jr., who is the CEO of Moody's Corporation. So we had a wonderful presentation by Andrea on the report. We know that the US and EU 27 are the world's largest bilateral trading relationship. They're the world's largest bilateral foreign investment relationship. And we also know that growth on both sides of the Atlantic has been rather disappointing since the financial crisis and Great Recession began in 2008. So I want to start by asking each of the panelists to spend just a few minutes saying what would be the top of your agenda in terms of priorities for restarting and reinvigorating growth in the EU, but also in the United States.
Thank you, Susan. So, addressing the issue of European Union and United States relationship, the first thing is trade and investment, as you said. Even without UK, the European Union will remain the biggest partner of the United States in trade and in investment. So what we need is to conclude a free trade agreement. I was extremely proud and honored to launch the TTIP together with President Obama. And we were negotiating in good faith with the United States of America. We hope that the United States of America do not give up on that. So the real issue here is not on the European side, is more on the American side. I'm going to be very blunt. You know, I left public office, my sincerity is increasing day by day. So when we say here in our task force, that of course I endorse in general, which does not mean that I agree with every specific point. When we say here that the US needs a reliable European partner, let me be blunt, Europe also needs a reliable American partner. We need a United States of America that believes in trade. We need a United States of America that honors its commitments regarding the European Union. We need a United States of America that respects the European Union as an entity. Of course, there are bilateral relationships, and certainly the United States will develop bilateral relationships with Germany, with France, and Italy, with all the important, and not probably so important if all have the same dignity, all our countries have the same dignity. But it is important, and that's the first condition. And that's a very important point politically, that the United States recognize that there is a European Union. There are important countries, but there is a European Union. Because on trade, it is the European Union that will discuss if the United States want to have a TTIP. Of course, it has to be a revised TTIP. Also in Europe, there were reservations regarding some of the initial proposals on TTIP. But I think we need it. And I think it will be really a pity if TTIP has the same fate that TPP. And I think it's possible. And by the way, I think that President Trump, if he's sincere, and I believe he is, about the promoting growth in the United States of America, it makes sense to have a treaty for trade with Europe for promote growth in both ways. Basically, reducing tariffs and basically with some regulatory convergence in many areas. That will be a great boost for Europe and the United States. And I think this is the key. Of course, afterwards, there are all the other issues that we have discussed in the first panel. I can come back to them. Europe has to do a lot of homework. But basically, in Europe, and that's a point that I want to make based on my 10 years experience leading the European Commission, the real issue is not so much in Brussels. Of course, Brussels can always do things better. And I can accept some of the criticisms that have done, that are done against the European Commission, also when I was there leading the Commission. But in fact, let me tell you, the resistance to the capital markets union that is indispensable, to a digital market, to energy, are not in Brussels, they are in some of our capitals. That's why I don't share the overall pessimism that I've heard in the first panel. I call it the intellectual glamour of pessimism. People want to be pessimists because they think it's more brilliant intellectually. Europe is doing not so bad after all. Europe is 1.7 growth now. There is no recession in Europe. Of course, there are huge problems, and we are not underestimating them. But in fact, all those that have predicted during the years and that I followed that, I mean, I was at the center of that response to the crisis. All those that were predicting Brexit, all those that are predicting the crumbling of the euro, they were wrong. And I think they continue to be wrong now if they continue to predict the worst. Unless, and that's my real important political point, unless things turn badly in France. The current problem of Europe, indeed, is France. Because France is the more central country in the European Union. The more important economy, we all know, it's Germany. But de facto, the most important country in Europe politically is France. And now that Britain is leaving, France will be the only permanent member of the Security Council in Europe. And France is the only country, as I always say, that is north and south. Germany is north, Italy is south. France is north and south. La France est incontournable. And one of the problems we have having all these last years in Europe is that we have a France that does not trust itself. There is a lack of confidence in France. And without France, nothing can happen. The issue of trust is critically important. Germany will be ready to go further in integration if they trust France. The real problem in Europe is not so much between Germany and Greece. It's between the lack of understanding between France and Germany. When you have a Germany that trusts France, and when France itself trusts itself, becoming more reformist, I can tell you that atmospherics in Europe will change dramatically. Because even the Brussels institutions, and Brussels, Strasbourg, Luxembourg, are to a large extent affected by the political ecology, by the political system in France. So, and when we have France does not trust itself, that projects negativism all over the system. So this is the reality. So that's why things can go very wrong if we have a populist, nationalist, xenophobic president in France. In that case, we will have an existential threat to the European Union and to the euro. In that case, prepare yourselves for the worst. But if that does not happen, and on the contrary, if you elect in France one of the most pro-European leaders France has ever had, in that case, there are conditions for Europe to go further. And it's not unrealistic what is said in the report. There are conditions. During the financial crisis, for instance, the Commission, myself, we launched the banking union. The European Union made progress even during the most difficult moments of the euro area crisis. In fact, today, The European Union has more power than before the financial crisis. The ECB, in some areas, has more powers than the Federal Reserve of the United States. The single supervisory mechanism, the single resolution mechanism, the project for the capital markets, of course. What we need to do now, and you probably are going to listen afterwards to former Prime Minister Ansip and Vice President of the Commission now, there is a possibility to do things, but that depends on the politics. And in politics, there are near misses, near victories, and near defeats. And that we don't know. So there are huge risks for Europe. I'm not underestimating the problems. At the same time, I believe there are conditions for Europe to prosper and to go further with the European integration process. And I think it will be fundamentally important that the United States support that. Because do not forget that the European integration process started to a large extent by American initiative. People tend, it was after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan. It was an initiative of the United States. The United States had the great strategic intelligence of wishing to have a united Europe instead of having a weak or divided Europe. So this is extremely important. The message is coming from here, but also the possibilities of working together, because I also believe, but we have not time probably to discuss this, that today the most important risks are not economically or financially. The most important risks today are political and geopolitical. And more than ever, we need a strong, sincere cooperation, I would call it complicity, between the United States and Europe.
Thank you. I'm so happy to hear some optimism. Let's go to you, Paula.
Well, I would first start with the fact that I don't think that there is a silver bullet in terms of the promotion of growth on each side of the Atlantic. I think that trade is one among a number of tools and instruments that promotes growth. And I liked it, in fact, what I liked about the report, and I want to congratulate the Atlantic Council on the report, was the fact that it addressed a number of paths forward, looking at the short term, the medium term, the long term. We know that with regard to trade agreements and the reality of trade agreements, let's go back to the last administration in the United States. It was stalled. They tried to get it forward in 2014, and it didn't. Negotiations weren't moving forward. So the fact is, if you want to genuinely promote growth, I think you have to, in your arsenal, have a variety of tools and instruments, including trade agreements, in advancing growth. So that's the first point I'd make. Secondly, I think that it's crucial to also look at the political arena. Look at what it was over these last years. I think the Eurozone crisis did impact certainly the political terrain, as well as the refugee crisis, as well as Brexit. All of these factors, I think, have had bearing on the question of growth and its path. It certainly, those crises really genuinely impacted the political economic landscape of Europe. This year, I think, a third key point is this year, I think one has to look at very critically the fact that there are these crucial elections. You mentioned France, but let me start with the Netherlands. The Netherlands, France, and then Germany. Why? I mention these because also post-Brexit, there is a debate. I don't know how this will turn out, but as you said, it depends on who gets elected and who comes forward. But there is a debate about the membership in the EU. It's out there. And it may go one direction, it may go in another direction. I state these things as a backdrop here for then my point about, well, how does one promote growth? I'm going to pick out one that maybe doesn't always get highlighted for a way forward that, by the way, doesn't always get burdened by other factors, but can actually be well promoted by, I think, reforms on this side of the Atlantic and also in Europe. And I want to single out Boyden Gregg, because he had, in the report, there were interviews of different task force members, and I was very struck by something that he said. He cited the private sector as being an engine of growth, and how, if given the opportunity for example, in its access to a varied capital, that actually it could go far. This is one of the tangible, I think, in concrete ways forward, looking at the European landscape. Here in the United States, as Boyden pointed out, we have lots of different access to different types of capital. Europe has rules, regulations, and a concentration on banks. So let's look for some creative ways and means, not just only traditional paths, because I think there are, and this is my concluding comment, I think there are some political realities that one has to deal with on this side of the Atlantic and also in Europe. And the political realities being the fact that, as we saw in our elections, by the way, Republican and Democrats alike, in this case, our two presidential candidates expressed their reservations about multilateral trade agreements. Now the new administration, the Trump administration, has placed an emphasis on bilateral agreements. And in Europe, there's the challenge of transparency. There's the challenge of political will towards reform, less bureaucracy. I think there are steps that need to be taken to have a kind of foundation from which to spring from. And we're not there. I think the political environment is such that it does impact the direction. But what is great about this session, I think the report really brings together some very good and creative thinking, looking at what is the case in terms of the trade arena, but also at the same time looking at some other creative paths forward. And one, I only mention one, I'll mention others as we go along, but the private sector is certainly an engine for growth.
Thank you. Let's turn to you, Gordon.
Thank you. I think it's worth taking one step back before we talk about economic measures, because the whole cooperation in the last 70 years between sort of the ever-growing democratic and capitalist Europe and the US was based on a fundamental assumption that we are the closest allies, value-based, shared value-based allies in the world. And as a consequence of the great financial crisis, subsequent populism, these fundamental pillars have recently been questioned. If you think about the questions raised about the validity of the NATO, Article 5 and the whole cooperation, if you think about some of the comments that are about whether it is at all in the interest of the United States to have Europe, the European Union kept together, those are very fundamental questions. And that has very strong impact on some of the European public opinion and the European decision makers, because the whole assumption was that we are bound together, like in a marriage when somebody suddenly asks at the dinner table, by the way, are we still supposed to be together? And that hit many of the public opinion leaders, even in Europe, a bit unexpected. On the other hand, much of the criticism is right. The European party within NATO has not been doing its fair share, so NATO needs some upgrade and reform. But the fundamental question has to be answered because, and I think the original assumption that Europe and US needs each other is stronger now than 60, 70 years ago. It's stronger now because I think as a result of the second phase of globalization, or I could say the revenge of globalization, is that both the US and the EU is gradually losing its global market share, whatever number you look at. And the other emerging forces in the world are not necessarily sharing the same values, fundamental values of democracy and sort of liberal capitalism. And private sector. And if that is questioned by others, then all the more reason that based on fundamental values, these two regions of the world should stick together and work together. And so that we have to reinforce those positive answers to this fundamental question. And if we find the positive answer for that, then we can go into this. And there is a lot to do in that on both sides of the Atlantic, I have to say. Europe has to find its answer to this populist streak, but also the US has to confirm where its fundamental interests lie. If that is answered, if that is answered, then I agree with Jose Manuel that maybe in a new form, in a renegotiated form, maybe with amended substance, or as the proposal says, step by step, wherever we have agreement, we should go ahead on trade and services and more cooperation, because that could add very significantly to the growth and wealth creation on both sides of the Atlantic. Let me just take one number from this report. My favorite number in this report is the total size of US foreign direct investment in Europe is $2,700 billion. The total size of US investment in China is 75 billion. So where is the fundamental interest? If Europe does well, what would that mean for the American economy? So I think based on this shared interest, we should go ahead with a renewed, maybe renamed, it's a good political idea, I have to say, it's a political merit of this report, a renamed TTIP. And, but what we learned from this great financial crisis is that political economy is back with a vengeance. It's not economic policy that is driving the world, and that's why if you read the Financial Times, you don't understand why Europe is still alive, why the euro still exists for the last 6-7 years. If you read that, it shouldn't exist. But it does because it's a political project. There are interests going beyond the simple economic factors that keeps the euro and Europe together until now. And we should help each other on both sides of the Atlantic to keep this political will together. That's the most important #1 step in my mind.
Thank you.
Thank you. With all of the political and policy expertise on this panel, I'm going to tread rather narrowly on the business side of things in the private sector. Dominant theme in both the US and Europe right now is uncertainty. Electoral uncertainty, policy uncertainty, economic uncertainty. And these obviously interrelate and can create a vicious cycle, can create virtuous cycles. But we are in a period which, unfortunately, I don't believe we're going to be able to move out of particularly quickly. So it's sort of a medium-term aspiration to move to a set of conditions that provide more certainty, which provides more stability. The business sector, financial markets don't like uncertainty. Uncertainty curtails demand. And I actually think that that is, especially in Europe, what we've seen during this period of quantitative easing is not a lack of availability of capital. It is a lack of demand for the capital that is available. And it's available for many institutions at very attractive rates. But there is not an interest or a willingness. I would say there's certainly an interest, but there is not a willingness to take the risk of business expansion and borrowing or raising capital for business expansion purposes. From Moody's perspective, I would say we see that in a number of ways, but I'll just mention two very quickly. First of all, it's who is borrowing. And what we've seen in Europe, certainly during the period of quantitative easing, is a very strong trend to the borrowers who are accessing the capital markets, the bond markets, are the same borrowers who already were. We have seen absolutely, zero acceleration of companies accessing the bond markets for the first time. And in fact, we are seeing more first-time companies going to the bond market in the US, which is already far more disintermediated than Europe is, as you've heard from the other panelists. And so that recycling of borrowing among companies that are refinancing debt, maybe seeking to do share repurchase activities, maybe mergers and acquisition activities, but we're not seeing it from new companies. And my second point, we are not seeing it for capital expenditure. We're not seeing it for investments in property, plant, and equipment, which is in my opinion, really the healthiest form of borrowing, and it has been essentially dormant in both the United States and in Europe for a number of years at this point. It is not a driver of borrowing activity in the capital markets, and historically, it played a much bigger role. I call it new money borrowing, new money to put to work in new kinds of business extensions and business expansion activities is the most dormant driver of debt raising in both markets at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bajnai, one of the favorite quotes in this report was actually yours. There are wonderful boxes with the task force members. And you are quoted as saying, so as former Prime Minister of Hungary, you were part of the integration of Europe, and you saw firsthand what it meant to have a new member state and Eastern European countries try to join the EU and the transitions that had to be made. But you said that Europe's integration is, and I quote, half-hearted, half-considered, and half-finished. I would love to hear more. It's a wonderful alliteration, but say more about what you consider half-finished, what the key next steps would be.
Right. There is a very good reason why it is so, because Europe is a grand test of creating a synthetic state based on very enlightened ideas. But it wasn't born out of natural nation building as mostly in history. And so the founding fathers of Europe has always reacted on a crisis and created something new at different times. And this something new, it was easy to do the popular part of something and leave behind the unpopular part. So there are suboptimal solutions. Let me give you examples. We have created the euro, a joint monetary policy without a joint fiscal policy. We have created Schengen, which is very popular. You can go without passports anywhere in Europe. But we didn't create a strong enough outside external border control because that was seen as a national sovereignty issue. But it doesn't work. Third example, we have created a so-called joint European foreign policy without a strong coordinated European defense and security policy. I mean, that's a half-hearted thing because, and we're not very efficient. Foreign policy does include defense and security, otherwise it's toothless. Sorry. So these are typical solutions, but it's also typical in Europe that when these half-baked solutions, suboptimal solutions are decided for, then comes the next crisis, highlighting these problems. And then under pressure, it is always easier to go further into integration than undo integration because it would be disaster. Think about the euro, think about Greek citizens standing at the ATMs, not able to take their own money out of the wall. Then it's turning around 180 degrees and accepting the austerity measures. So yes, under pressure, Europe's answer has always been more integration. I would expect, and that's where I have a debate with the very relevant question raised by the previous panel on political realism, that I think undoing Europe or significant parts of Europe would be politically and economically, socio-economically so painful, for example, the euro, that it would collapse Europe into civil war and unthinkable consequences and lose its status in the world as it is today. As opposed to finding sometimes a painful sacrifice of national sovereignty in the case of integration does help Europe to answer globalization. I think the EU today, the raison d'etre of the EU today, is that it is Noah's Ark in the flood of globalization. And those who jump off this Noah's Ark may sort of get lost in the water.
Okay, another good quote. Jose Manuel, I want to ask you about something that hasn't come up in either really the previous panel or this panel yet, which are the Brexit negotiations, which supposedly will be triggered with Article 50 this month, we're expecting. The report talks about basically taking a softer approach on the part of the EU to the Brexit negotiations. What do you think the right path forward is? What do you think a best case outcome for both the EU and the UK would be as these negotiations commence?
I think the Article 50 trigger will happen. I think Prime Minister May, she's leading Brexit inside Britain with wisdom. Of course, she had to unite her party. It's a very ironic situation because Theresa May, she said that she voted Remain, so now she's trying, so she is leading exactly the opposite. So it's very difficult for a politician to lead exactly the scenario that he or she did not want. So it's extremely difficult also from a British perspective. In Europe, the reality is that there is not yet a consolidated position. We have to wait, as we know, for the elections. By the way, I consider that we have elections is good. I will be concerned if there are not elections in Europe. And in fact, that was what happened some time before. I think it's important to listen to what Gordon said. And I invite you to think in perspective, historic perspective. In Europe, some of our European partners, some years ago, they had no elections that were under totalitarian communism. And the south of Europe, until the 70s, also under authoritarian. So Europe is much stronger today than it was 20 years before, much stronger, much better in all possible indicators: social, economic, scientific, political. And that's why, and this is not because I'm optimistic, it's not at all, it's the reality. So, and if you go back to the 20th century, to the Shoah, to the disasters, what happened in Europe, it was the most important tragedy in the history of mankind. More people killed in the two world wars, the European world wars that started in Europe, than in all the history of mankind. So that's why I don't agree with those people who are saying that it's the end of Europe. You see? No, that was a parenthesis. Now, the issue about Brexit is that the European Union, until now, European Union countries to now, they've united in what, for me, it's obvious. It's a lowest common denominator. No cherry picking. That's the message they have conveyed to Britain. And for a good reason, not because they want to punish Britain, that would be ridiculous, because it would be punish themselves, but because it's difficult to give a country that leaves a situation that is better than that when it was there. Because let's imagine now that the result of negotiations was Britain to have full access to the internal market without freedom of movement of people. That will be the encouragement to Mrs. Le Pen to say, I want the same. I want to get rid of all migrants that come to my country. I don't want those citizens from the new member states, because that's the reality. That's part of the issue. That was part of the vote in Britain, and it's part of the debate in France and in other countries, because we have too many foreigners. And so people make a confusion between what we call in Europe freedom of movement and migration, because in European terms, we don't consider that migration. We consider that someone that comes from Poland to France, it's an internal movement inside the European Union. While in the debate in Britain, they were considering this as migrants, external migrants, you see? That's the point. So the countries so far have been in the lowest common denominator, but I think with time of negotiations, I expect both Britain and the EU27 to understand that that should not be a zero-sum game negotiation, because that's the problem. Mm-hmm. In fact, if Europe goes not well, this is not good for Britain. Britain will remain a very important European country, and in fact one of the biggest countries in the world in economic terms. And the European Union 27 will be by far the most important partner economically, trade-wise, investment-wise of Britain. So, and until now, on both sides, there have been confrontational signals that are completely, I think, counterproductive. They need to cooperate at the end for something that is a reasonable agreement. So an amicable a separation. Sometimes it happens also in life. I hope that that will be the result. And in that case, of course, I think we have to be realistic. There are negative consequences. That's quite, but we should mitigate the negative consequences. And it is possible. It is possible by a constructive negotiation. And I hope that when we have the situation settled in France and Germany, then with all the other countries, of course, but without those two, nothing works in Europe. That's my experience, let me tell you very frankly. Without a pre-agreement between France and Germany, it's impossible to get anything done in Europe. So that's not sufficient, but that's indispensable. I believe that it is possible afterwards to engage in a constructive discussion. I think it will be the interest of all Europe, including the UK, to have this pragmatic, adult conversation, and at the end, a positive result.
One quick follow-on question. What do you think is going to happen with the very many people, Europeans, living and working in London and other parts of the UK, and the many Brits living in Brussels and working there and throughout?
That should be one of the easiest points. It's quite obvious. The Europeans living in the UK, they will keep their rights, and the British living in the European Union will keep their rights. It's a so clear negotiation. In fact, as you know, the House of Lords wanted already now to grant it, even without. But the position of the Prime Minister was, no, I don't want to keep that for the negotiation. But it's obvious that there are many Brits living, for instance, in Spain. And so it will become absolutely negative now that they lose their rights. I mean, I think it will be even, it will be a scandal. At the same time, those Europeans that are established in Britain, why should now they put out? In fact, Britain needs them. Britain is attracting a lot of people outside, and it's part of the glamour of London is that it has been able to attract some of the best in many professions. So I don't think that's really. I think there will be much more difficult points of negotiation. One of them will be, of course, it is already the financial sector. That is an important issue because in some countries in Europe, there is a clear willingness not to accept that Britain keeps the same rights of access to the internal market in financial terms that it has now. There was already a debate, by the way, before. Don't forget there was a case of the ECB against the United Kingdom because of clearing outside of the euro area. Mm-hmm. And at that time, the European Court of Justice decided, in my point of view rightly, that there could not be a discrimination against the United Kingdom because the United Kingdom, not being a member of the euro area, was a member of the European Union. And so the principle of non-discrimination applies. But now if the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, it's no longer the case. So there will be an issue there. That's going to be extremely difficult. And in fact now, all the financial institutions that are based in London, American, Swiss, Japanese, Chinese, there are more than 1,000. They are all making contingency plans for that. So that's one effect of instability. And there are many other. So this is going to be difficult. Another issue, for me, probably the most difficult issue will be the customs union because Theresa May, she took, I think, a wise decision. She said, we don't want bits of the internal market, so we want to have a clear Brexit. So she does not say hard Brexit. Some people call it hard Brexit. But of course, what she said is no bits of the internal market, but we can afterwards negotiate some specific arrangements for some sectors. And one of the points is how can Britain negotiate free trade agreements with third countries if they are not in the customs union? Because the customs union, as you know, supposes a common external tariff. For instance, an agreement with the United States. That could be a possibility, an FTA between UK and the United States. By the way, about that, when I speak about trade agreement between the United States and Europe, of course, I consider it's a bilateral agreement. And that's something that some teams, because here in the United States, some people think, an agreement between the United States and Europe is a multilateral agreement. No, and the European Union is one trade part. So it's impossible for the United States to have a trade agreement with Germany, or with Italy, or with France, and that will never happen. With Britain, yes, because Britain is going to leave the European Union. So that's different. So the TTIP is different from TPP. The TPP was an agreement between the United States and several Asian countries that was, in fact, now killed. What an irony, eh? When you remember that the policy of the United States was pivot to Asia. It was a policy of the United States some time ago. see what happened. Now, the reality is that Britain can have there a very important role in terms of free trade between the United States and Europe. But if Britain wants an FTA with China, don't forget that Prime Minister Cameron spoke about this. Yeah. I don't know exactly what the current government thinks. But it will be impossible to have an FTA agreement with China, an FTA agreement with the United States, and to be at the same time in the customs union of the European Union. So that's going to be one of the most difficult issues to clarify. Ideally, I think we should have an FTA between Europe and the UK with some specific arrangements for some sectors. And I think this is possible. By the way, if the European Union, I negotiated, I don't know how many trade agreements we have done with Singapore, with Korea, with Canada. Afterwards, there were the problems, as you remember, with Canada. We have negotiated with Central America, with Peru and Colombia. So if we have FTA agreements with those countries, why shouldn't we have European Union and an FTA with Britain? That's what makes sense. The lowest possible tariffs, the lowest possible difficulties. And then have afterwards some specific arrangements for some sectors. That is, for instance, for research, that's a specific issue where I believe it's in the interest of both to have a strong cooperation in research and science between Europe and UK. So I think it's feasible if there is goodwill, if there is also some, let's say, wisdom and reason, and we have people reasonable around the table. And I know that many of the people around the table in Europe want that kind of constructive approach.
Thank you. I want to turn to you, Mr. McDaniel. You run a global corporation, presumably with a very large office in London. Two questions for you. One is, how do you see the future of London as a global and European hub for capital, given the Brexit arrangements? If, in fact, a lot of business is going to move out of London, who's going to pick it up, do you think? And then the second question comes down to securitization, which is part of the Capital Markets Union, which is to promote more securitization in Europe. In the US, we securitize mortgages, residential mortgages, commercial mortgages, various other types of debt. But securitization markets have not really taken off at all in Europe. And now there's a proposal as one way to unlock funding for growth to have more securitization. Now, many of you in this room may remember that, in fact, certain types of securitization are what sparked a devastating global financial crisis. So start with London, given the Brexit negotiations, and then let's talk about what are the prospects for, I'm going to call it, healthy securitization in Europe.
Yeah, I think the challenge that London and the UK are particularly going to be facing is that the pace of policy decision-making, and the pace of business decision-making, I think, are going to increasingly move at different speeds. Businesses, and this goes back to my initial comments, don't like uncertainty. They're willing to put up with some level of uncertainty for some period of time. But eventually, businesses are going to feel that they have to start making decisions. And my concern would be that that is going to have to be ahead of the level of certainty that you'd like to see in the arrangements between the UK and the continent. What that means, I think, is that businesses are going to have to start making decisions about hedging their bets, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of getting incremental assets, resources into what will be the European Union of the future. This is particularly an issue for London and for the financial services sector, but not exclusively. We, and you're correct, London is our second largest office globally. And we are looking at what we are going to likely have to move and over what time frame. And for a business like ours, that's really just talking about people. We don't have other assets that we've really got to think about moving. But it's what kind of rebalancing between the UK and the EU is going to be considered acceptable by EU policymakers, EU regulators, the people that we have to deal with? And what would we be able to leave in the UK? Is it going to be only the business that serves the UK? Is it going to be something broader? These are very practical business questions, and they're not going to wait for clarity or perfect clarity on how the divorce and then the renegotiated relationships are going to work. With respect to securitization, Europe, I think, is of two minds: grow it or kill it. It's interesting to me, having been with Moody's through the financial crisis in the U.S. and now looking at it, with hindsight. Certain areas of securitization, most areas of securitization, performed very, very well through the financial crisis. It was everything that touched U.S. mortgages that was just radioactive. So the collateralized loan obligation part of the market, the auto receivables part of the market, those performed far, far better through the financial crisis. It was mortgages. And so, I would hope that, there's not a notion of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, looking at what the real root causes for the mortgage problem in the U.S., and there are plenty of institutions, public and private, that can share in participating in the root cause of that problem. But it has also proved a very viable business sector for getting money to, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises. It is the most active part of the U.S. securitization market today, is the collateralized loan obligation market, and that is dealing with companies, packaging assets of companies that are small to medium-sized for the most part. So it would seem to be an opportunity in Europe for that sector. But again, there are some very strong reactions on both sides as to whether to grow it or kill it.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the audience after one more question for Paula. So start thinking about what you want to ask. I want to touch on geopolitical stability. So in the opening remarks, several of you talked about the shared values between the U.S. and EU, the NATO alliance. We have had a lot of turmoil between Russia and the Ukraine to the east, and then, of course, ongoing Middle East turmoil to the south of Europe. Can you give us more insight about what you think the right relationship is to continue to foster that sort of stability between the two sides of the Atlantic, to be a bulwark against political and military turmoil outside of that?
Well, I think that by all of the statements here, and then what undergirds the report itself, is that the transatlantic relationship matters greatly. Why? Because we are bound by history, by common values, by our political, economic, and military considerations. It goes deep, it goes wide. So I'd start with that backdrop that the transatlantic relationship does matter. That doesn't mean that in different areas that we're not going to diverge, or we may have to, as has been suggested here, go back to the drawing board on, for example, the issue of TTIP. But I think that this discussion undergirds a very important point that Gordon made, and that is how these considerations are also very much interwoven with security considerations. In fact, one of the values, I think, of this report, it focuses on Euro growth and the importance of heightening and growing the resources in Europe. As we know afoot is the NATO question and burden sharing. I see this discussion as being invaluable. I think the recommendations are invaluable in all the sectors mentioned. Why? Because it's in everyone's interest in having Euro growth and its resources grown, because those resources can, in fact, be invested in one of the sectors is the security sector. Mm-hmm. And in terms of burden sharing, I think which we have a very common interest in. So I think that we're very much intertwined. I think that we do have to look ways for collaborating. that are political, economic, and in the security sector. And I don't see us as stepping out of that, even though there are changes. And I think there have to be, as I've already suggested, I think there does have to be, you use the word political will, I think there does have to be political will and reforms. I think also here in the United States, we're going through reforms and a big debate and a discussion. Our publics, another commonality here, our publics have definitely stepped forward on the continent of Europe and also in the United States in calling for change, wanting governmental change, wanting also greater transparency, I'd say, in many of the issues that we're discussing. Finally, I guess I would just add this, and just to put in the mix, I had mentioned earlier, I do think trade matters, but I don't think it's, there's a silver bullet. It's the sole panacea here. And I think the reality is that will be back to the drawing board, maybe renamed, maybe something else. But I think we should look at other avenues. And I just want to draw out, because it probably won't be mentioned, in the report, it wasn't only private sector, but energy was also mentioned. Too, the importance of energy diversification, how that affects and grows economies, I thought was a crucial one, and also innovation. Innovation is always the backbone of growth in any society, and that too was touched upon.
I just want to clarify something, because I don't think there is a disagreement there.
No.
I mentioned trade because you asked what the United States and Europe can do together. Of course, I fully agree that essential for Europe to promote growth are many other issues that we have to do, namely in economic reforms in Europe. But we were addressing in the panel, that I think the title of the panel, what the United States and Europe, and that is for me clearly the priority, because it's not the United States that's going to make the structural reforms that France or Italy need. That's France and Italy that have to do it. Now, what can we do together if we want to promote growth? What is the issue that can be done if we want to do it? It's trade. A trade agreement, an investment agreement. That is for me clear. But okay, we can decide, there are no conditions now, political conditions. But in that case, we have to be honest about ourselves. In that case, we are missing an opportunity. I continue to think that is essential for growth between the two sides of the Atlantic to have a free trade agreement and more regulatory convergence. If we don't, and also by geopolitical reasons, even more urgent now than before. Now, if we, Europeans or Americans, or both, decide, no, we cannot do it, in that case, I think it's a defeat. It's a mistake. And that's the point I wanted to clarify.
Let me just, I'm going to take a 30-second, just,
Okay.
no, I know that you said that. I was broadening it, and the reason why I was broadening it was the way the report was structured.
Okay.
The report was structured short-term, medium-term, long-term. And the only reason I said trade does matter, as I've just said, in this case, but I was trying to also pick out, right now, I think there are issues that need to politically be addressed. So I'm looking at it from where we're standing. Are there other ways of collaborating? That was my only point in integrating that in that chronology of short-term, medium-term, long-term.
Okay, let's take a couple questions, and then I'll open it up to all the panelists to give answers. Let's start right here, and then we'll go over here if we have two microphones roving.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Astrid Kimball from Google. We, too, care a lot about trade and the transatlantic relationship, and it was a McKinsey report recently that said that there's more trade in data based on data flows than physical goods. So my question is about the EU-US Privacy Shield, and I'm optimistic for the technology and innovation being a pillar of the EU-US relationship, but could you talk a little bit about whether you're optimistic as well?
Okay, great. Now we have a question over here.
Yes, thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. I'm grateful to Paula Dobriansky for reminding us that there is a struggle going on between, let's say, two forces, right? The forces of a defense of liberal free trade, the liberal world order, transparency, immigration, diversity, and a more nationalistic course. We have to realize that. But isn't it a strange irony of history that it is today President Xi of China who defends free trade, happened in the G20, it happened in Davos, Switzerland, and not the United States, where this order was conceived and has produced so much success. Look at income, look at growth, economic growth, look at poverty, look at life expectancy, and how come that we didn't hear that message from the United States? Can you help us a little bit to make it stick again? Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question here and then here.
Thank you so much. My name is Thanos Dimaris. I'm a journalist and I represent Ivy, which is the biggest network of young professionals across the United States. I'm the policy program director in Ivy. So my question is, what do you think about the debate in Europe right now regarding the multi-speed European project, which means that some countries are going forward, some other countries are left behind? And how do you think that this will impact countries which are facing huge structural problems, like Greece, for example, like Portugal, like Spain? Do you think that this is a threat for the European project? Because I remember with Mr. Barroso, many interviews we had together in the European Commission, we were discussing this issue and how the multi-speed Europe can be like a threat or something that can benefit Europe. And one second question, do you think that President Trump is sharing the same view with President Obama about the interconnectedness between the American and the European economy? Do you see that the current US presidency is fully committed to support the Eurozone project, the Euro and the sustainability inside the Eurozone? Thank you so much.
Terrific. One last question, and then the panelists will each get one chance to respond.
Chris Bladowski from Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation. I'd like to pick on this question and enlarge it a little bit. When I look at the EMU, there were two types of criteria for admission. There was the political will, and then there were the economic criteria, with the political angle clearly trumping the economics of the EMU. And with the concentric circles, I see roughly the same thing, that it's very highly politically driven. Is there economics behind the concentric circles? Is there a fiscal, monetary equation to it, criteria for admission, so that when there is a group of concentric circles, the group can rely on sound economics to carry forward the type of projects that we saw on the thing? Fiscal, monetary, energy, I think capital markets were mentioned there. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Let's let each of the panelists, you can pick and choose if you have forgotten the questions, I've written them down. Let's start with you, Ray.
I'll make a quick comment on the multi-speed Europe. This is not a Moody's view. This is a personal view. I think there are clearly some benefits from a multi-speed approach, but the thing that I really worry about, just looking from a distance, and I'm not the expert that some of my colleagues up here are, is complexity. It is the process by which the European Union is moving forward is already phenomenally complex. Right. And introducing a multi-speed component, what I would worry about looking at it, again, from a distance and from a business perspective, is complexity.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'd like to elaborate on that as well, because I think this is the news of the week, that there was a very strong determination by the four largest members of the Eurozone after the Versailles dinner about practically proclaiming that multi-speed Europe is the way forward. And I think it was long expected, and it was long worked on in the background. And it's very logical from the stalled situation where Europe is in. And I agree, it's already very complex. But Europe, because, as I said, half-baked, half considered half-finished, cannot stay where it is. It has to go forward. Multi-speed Europe concept is practically means that the core countries who are Eurozone countries, and therefore their interest is much more strongly tied and handcuffed together, some feel handcuffed together, they have to break out of this current situation. Now, why is it so difficult to do fiscal integration? And that's one of the key recommendations of this report. If you think about it, that's been always the most difficult decision in the history of European Union, because fiscal policy is the heart of politics. Fiscal policy is how much money I take from you and give to him. That's politics. That's national politics. Every year, the budget is the biggest decision in the parliament. So if you take a significant portion of that decision-making power to the Brussels level, as it partly happens through rules, then you will give up the power of national politics. Now, there are two problems with that. One, there is no strong European political identity. There are national identities in Europe, so political decisions are made at national levels. That's one very difficulty. There was, when Italy got united in 1861, thank you, there was an Italian politician who went to in the first session of the new Italian parliament, said, we have created Italy, now we need to create Italians. And that's an issue for Europe. And identity will develop against common enemies, common challenges, crises. We are much more European when we think about our differences with China or, I don't know, Australia, as opposed to when French and Germans look at each other. So that's one issue in terms of creating a fiscal policy at the Brussels level. The other is if there is no stronger legitimacy at the Brussels decision-making level, how will people accept what's happening? Look at Greece. Greece has learned it in the hard way. They have elected 3 different governments in 18 months, and each had to conclude the same economic policy. It's like the famous saying about the Ford T model, you can have this car in any color as long as it's black. So they kept changing governments, but they were pushed to continue because that was the European reality. Now, if a much bigger country, a founding country of the European Union, will feel the same way, they could revolt. So there has to be a political reform to enable fiscal integration.
Thank you.
The liberal international order is being challenged. And as we know, post-World War II, that order has maintained peace, stability, and security. It has been an important framework for maintaining that stability. We need to, with our friends and allies, stand up for that. At the same time, I would also add that the global international environment has changed dramatically since post-World War II. And with that should also come some institutional thought being given to institutional change. That's where I would see it.
Okay.
Regarding the issue of multi-speed, that's a very old issue in Europe. People are discussing that for many years. There were proposals to have the Core Europe, the famous Schäuble-Lammers report. It was made by the current finance minister of Germany at that moment, already I think in the 80s. At the end, it was not well received by the smaller, medium-sized countries because they saw it as a way of creating a kind of a directorium. Now, what happens, in fact, is that already today we have a different speed Europe. We have countries in the Euro, countries out of the Euro. We have countries in Schengen, countries out of Schengen. Not only Britain, other countries. And in fact, already today, it is possible from an institutional point of view, because there is an article called Enhanced Cooperation that allows, if at least 9 countries accept to go forward in any project of integration, can be defense, can be financial, markets, can be energy, they can do it, provided, and that is the issue, that the project remains open to those that wish to join and that ideally should fulfill the conditions for joining. So already today, but until now it was never possible to activate that article, which is interesting. So at the end it's a matter of political will. Now, some people in some of the bigger countries and founding countries, they like to think that it's because the European Union is too big, because that they don't go further. That's simply not true. The reality is that until now, the protests for more integration were not stopped by the new member states, but by France and the Netherlands. The Constitutional Treaty, remember, it was not the new member states that objected. It was founding members. So that's why we have to be extremely careful to avoid a kind of stratification of Europe. Not only because it adds unnecessary complexity, as you rightly said, and business and private sector investors don't like it. Already now the European Union is very difficult to read, but because of an issue of division and polarization. Now, what we have to do, and that requires a lot of statesmanship, what we have to do is to have the recognition of the increased variety and diversification of Europe. It's quite obvious that at 28 or 27, we cannot have the same kind of working that we have where we're 6 or 10 or 12. I remember well that time I was a member of the European Council when we were 12. I was a young foreign minister. People now, at the time of Delors, Mitterrand, Kohl, people now tend to idealize the past. It was terribly difficult to take decisions in the European Union with 12. It was sometimes not easier than today with 28. That's completely false. The idea that before everything was simple now, that's not true. The conditions of power are today much more difficult. The communication, the media, it's much more demanding. The pressure today in a prime minister or in a commission is much stronger than before. There's a fundamental change in the way of dealing with power today. It's nothing comparable. Now, but it was not because of 12 or 28. The question is to do it in a way that is not so differentiation, diversification without stratification, if I can use those words. That is the point. And for that point of view, yes, countries, and that's what the report basically says. It speaks about concentric circles. I'm not completely sure that it should be all the time concentric, but yes, those countries want to go forward. They should be allowed to do it. In fact, they should go if the system is kept open for the other ones. If not, that will create a terrible mistrust between the countries that are left out. And don't forget that at the end of the euro, that's what happened. People, when the euro was created, the Economic and Monetary Union, the idea of some of the people was for a very reduced number of countries. You remember that? It was not supposed, for instance, in Berlin, in Paris, that Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Italy would be members. Italy made a great effort, it was brilliant Ciampi, to meet the conditions to become a member. But the idea at the beginning was to have a reduced euro. That was the idea. By the way, I read sometimes here that it was an imposition of Germany. It was exactly the opposite. It was France who asked for Germany to have a common currency, and that was the price that Germany paid to have the unification. That's when some people today write and say here in the United States that the euro is a project for Germany to keep a competitive advantage and that Germany wants a weak euro. I mean, my experience is exactly the opposite. Germany wants a strong euro. Okay, so and this was what happened. And that shows why it was political, because the countries, a country like Italy or like Spain, or my own country, and I participate in that decision. When we decided to go there to the euro, why? Because we said, if there is an euro, an economic monetary union, let's say with 9 or 12 countries only in Europe, or 9 or even less countries, we are going to be left outside. So the core decisions, the power is going to be there. And that's why, for instance, it will be afterwards those countries were extremely clear that they will not accept if they will not join the euro. Like, for instance, Spain. Spain was extremely important in all those discussions. So this is what I want to tell you. We have to do some flexibility in Europe, yes, it's obvious, but without meaning stratification. If not, that will create even more polarization and more division in Europe, and that I don't think is in the interest of the Europeans as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all for sharing your views and insights. And it's unfortunately time for us to move on.
So, let me, of course, thank you, all of you.
Okay, no, but I want to clarify that.
I want just briefly to introduce Vice President Ansip, Vice President of the European Commission, and Commissioner for the Digital Single Market. In his capacity, Vice President Ansip is tasked with creating a connected digital single market and making Europe a world leader in information and communication technology. Vice President Ansip has been one of probably the longest serving Prime Minister in European Union as Prime Minister of his own country, Estonia. So I'm honored to hand over to you, Vice President Ansip, to provide concluding remarks today. And I have to remember that when we started this initiative exactly 1 year ago, basically the same day, we had Vice President Katainen came and launching the initiative. So we are happy we have here you basically to launch our first full report of the task force. Please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to speak at the Atlantic Council today. It is a pleasure to be back in Washington, and I'm especially happy that together with us in this meeting there is also honorable former President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. During all those years, you used to work as President of the European Commission, and I used to work as Prime Minister of Estonia. We tried to deepen relations between the United States and the European Union, and I think we were pretty successful in this. Thank you. On both sides of the Atlantic, in every country of the world, we are bombarded by relentless political, social, and economic forces. These pressures have started to test many old alliances, many long accepted ways of working together. For some, it can be tempting to break away, to go it alone and leave the rest behind. But for me, trying to sort out your own problems at the expense of others does not work. It certainly does not work for the common good. To tackle the new challenges, we need to work together more, not less. That means more global cooperation, more transatlantic cooperation, more European cooperation. One might think that the European project is in danger, but in many areas we are working together more than ever. With energy, for example, we are building energy infrastructure that spans country borders. Why spend this money? So that everyone in Europe has greater energy security and so that energy prices stay low. EU countries recently set up border and coast guards. Again, why? Because it is more effective to tackle the new challenges together, particularly on migration and internal security. So we work together. The general response of European countries to challenges like these tends to be one of more solidarity, to create new opportunities by acting in unity. That is what the European project is about, right from its start. It is why today we have peace, democracy, prosperity, and employment in a market economy. I know this firsthand from my own country, Estonia, which has drawn enormous benefit from the EU since it joined as a full member in 2004. Since then, Estonia's GDP has grown by 140%. Exports have almost tripled. Average salaries are now 2.6 times higher than just before EU accession. In fact, every country that has joined the EU is now more prosperous than before. On its own, no single EU country could have achieved as much as Europe has achieved collectively in the last 60 years. We are united and we are working together, but not just internally or for ourselves. We work with our international partners too. That is why I welcome the Year Growth Task Force report, which highlights the areas that we need to focus on our European and transatlantic cooperation. It points to specific projects that can be completed in the next 24 months. That especially applies to digital matters. If you think digital, you think global. Just 15 years ago, less than a generation, digital flows barely existed. They now generate more economic value than traditional flows of traded goods. We are in a new era of digital globalization. That interesting phrase recently caught my eye in a report by McKinsey. The new era it talks about is defined by data flows that transmit information, ideas, and innovation. We live in a world that has never been more deeply linked by commerce, communication, and travel. Today, almost every type of cross-border transaction has a digital component. Data lies at the heart of the fourth industrial revolution. Global data flows are surging. They are part of today's trade reality. Within a decade, they have raised world GDP by at least 10%, 7.8 trillion US dollars in 2014 alone. Data flows between the United States and Europe are the world's highest, 50% more than those between the US and Asia. The United States and the European Union are also the two largest net exporters of digital goods and services to the rest of the world. Not only that, the US is the largest market for many European digital services and vice versa. So, logically, we both have a strong interest in keeping data flowing freely. It is where transatlantic cooperation brings added value to both EU and US economies and societies. In terms of employment, the transatlantic workforce numbers around 15 million, with millions more in indirect jobs. Foreign direct investment by the EU and United States in each other's economies directly supports around 7 million American and European jobs. As global technology leaders, we share much common ground in our approach. Naturally, there are differences between us as between the countries of the European Union. But there is more that unites than divides Europe and the United States. Firstly, maintaining open markets for digital trade and keeping the internet as a free, open, and interoperable platform. Secondly, innovation-friendly policies that strengthen conditions for digital entrepreneurship, competitiveness, and investment. That means maximizing the positive impact of digital technologies to create jobs and growth. It also means properly protecting competition as well as consumers. And it means that the integrity of data will be increasingly important in terms of privacy, personal data protection, and cybersecurity. As part of our work to build a digital single market, we will be tackling restrictions on the free flow of data, including legal barriers. This goes hand in hand with stronger personal data protection measures. The aim is to raise trust, security, and people's confidence online. Over recent months, the EU and United States have created strong protective measures for the transatlantic transfer of personal data. Now that the Privacy Shield is in place and more than 1,700 US companies have signed up to it, the rights of Europeans are fully protected and data flows are facilitated. So it is vital that we retain and stand by the firm guarantees that were made. I welcome the strong commitment of Secretary Ross to keep and develop the Privacy Shield. I met with him yesterday and he confirmed his position. This message has rarely well received in Europe. Given that the Privacy Shield will be assessed every year, I will be directly involved in ensuring that our relations grow stronger as a result. Turning briefly to cybersecurity, it is clear that neither Europe nor America can work in isolation. No country or region can realistically fight these attacks on its own. Maintaining a safe, open and secure cyberspace to promote economic and social development is a challenge for all countries. We know that there are justified security concerns about the Internet of Things as cyber-physical systems link together. This will not remain inside one country's borders. The IoT is global. As these systems interconnect, they will become smarter, more powerful, and more capable. They will bring opportunities, both social and economic. They will also become more vulnerable, so consumers may risk being hacked. Interoperability is clearly important, but so is security, which makes it important to define and establish global IoT standards. This is an area where Europe and the United States must work together with a shared interest. Later in 2017, the EU will review its cybersecurity strategy to strengthen its focus on tackling cybercrime, guaranteeing network security, and working closely with our partners around the world. That includes the United States as a priority, especially given the strong interest expressed by the new US administration to bolster cybersecurity capabilities. There are, of course, other areas where international cooperation is needed. Take internet governance, where Europe and the United States can stand together to create a leadership model for the world. Here, both sides already work well together to secure an open internet. I trust this cooperation will continue, and making it possible to develop innovative services provided that they do not harm the internet's availability and quality. The smooth transition for after the contract expired between the US Department of Commerce and ICANN allowed us to retain the multi-stakeholder approach to internet management. The alternative meant leaving it to intergovernmental process, potentially more arbitrary. Let me mention another area where we need good transatlantic cooperation, 5G. For Europe, one of our primary concerns is to avoid global fragmentation, particularly for spectrum selection and standards. In fact, the goal is to achieve maximum global alignment. While I know we have differences in approach, I would like to see moves towards achieving a more multilateral consensus. Ladies and gentlemen, I said earlier that there is more that unites us than divides us. Europe and the United States have a long history of deep political and economic ties. As I have described, the major data flows between us show that these strong links also extend to the digital realm. By working together, Europe and the United States will strengthen trust and confidence in the online world as new technologies emerge and develop. That is what will drive our digital future, building on our long-standing history of trust, cooperation, and mutual understanding to further the global digital market. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President, for your comments and for joining us today in this timely moment for US-EU relation. We really look forward to continue our work with the European Commission. And thank you very much for spending 3.5 hours at the Atlantic Council. It's a lot. It's not for our standard. We usually keep things very short, but we had very good panels and very good intervention and very good questions. So we look forward to see you next time to our next event, likely during the spring meetings of the IMF World Bank. Thanks again.